It was Friday, February 19, 1937. A Stinson airplane was traveling from Brisbane's Archfield Aerodrome to Sydney. There were 7 people on board, 5 passengers and 2 pilots. Along the way, the plane was meant to pick up some passengers in Lismore, but it never arrived. The official search centered around Newcastle and the Hawkesbury River, hundreds of miles south, where some people said they saw or heard the plane. The authorities took a statement from the postmaster in Hawkesbury. He said he'd heard the plane pass overhead just after 5 in the evening on the day it disappeared. Since he knew a lot about the aircraft, the authorities were convinced by his statement. But others believed something else. People who lived in the McPherson Ranges, on the border between Queensland and New South Wales, heard the aircraft going overhead at the same time it always did. People in the area knew about the flight from Brisbane. Some of them saw the blue and red Stinson plane vanishing into the clouds. After days of searching, nothing was found. At this point, a bushman called Bernard O'Reilly decided to take matter into his own hands. He lived in that high area of the country and remembered that there had been a powerful storm on the night of the disappearance. A big cyclone going over the mountains had made it impossible for the locals to do any work. On Saturday, February 27th, O'Reilly decided to go and find the missing aircraft and find out what had happened. The day before, he had gathered all the evidence on where the plane could be. O'Reilly got his ruler out and drew a line across a map to the last known place where the plane had been heard. He saw that the line crossed 4 high points. He was sure that the aircraft had never got beyond the nearby mountain range. He packed some food, climbed onto his horse, and set out. He rode to Mount Bithingable, then set his horse home. He continued on foot through the dense rainforest. He could barely see. The vines in the forest were as thick as wire netting. There wasn't much light that day, and he struggled to get his bearings. O'Reilly searched for clues to understand where he was. He looked for patterns in tree growth and differences in the level of bloom among the plant species. He tried to spot different birds' nests, which would indicate his altitude. He spent Saturday night in the wet forest and continued his search the next day. From the top of Mount Throckban, through a brief opening in the clouds, O'Reilly saw some high rocks. He suspected the Stinson aircraft had crashed there. Far to the southwest, in the endless green forest, he spotted a light brown treetop. This was an unnatural color for the late summer and seemed out of place. Fires happen rarely in the rainforest, but lightning strikes were possible. Could it just be a coincidence? Judging by his map, the tree was 8 miles away. O'Reilly pushed through the forest to reach it. When he was 3 miles away from the spot, he heard 2 voices calling out cooeys. This is a shout-out used by the Australian bush to attract attention, find missing people, or indicate someone's location. He thought it could be other search teams, and answering would have confused them. So he kept silent and continued walking toward the location of the voices. He crossed a gorge and climbed up high. He called out to see if anyone was there, but still got no reply. He walked back 600 feet along the plateau and shouted again. That was when he heard a response and headed toward it. O'Reilly finally arrived and saw a big tree which had been cut down. The entire trunk of another tree was burned, and there was a mass of metal on the ground. Finally, he saw 2 men. The other 4 hadn't made it. The 2 he found were the passengers Joseph Binstead and James Proud. But as soon as he saw them, he couldn't talk. Judging by their condition, O'Reilly knew he had possibly arrived too late to save the 2 men. It was 4 p.m. on Sunday. By that time, the 2 men had been alone in the forest for 9 days. Proud couldn't move because he had injured his leg, and Binstead had been carrying water for both of them. They had only found berries to eat and had lost all hope until O'Reilly appeared. There wasn't much daylight left, and O'Reilly decided to head back using a different, shorter route to get help. He came across someone on the way. O'Reilly told them what had happened and asked to borrow their horse. He later used a utility truck to reach someone's farm and call for help. On the farm, he found the number of a Mr. Robinson from Airlines of Australia using the Brisbane phone directory. O'Reilly called him and explained things, and asked if he could organize a rescue party for the 2 survivors. Robinson agreed. O'Reilly and the farmer put together 2 separate groups. The first party, led by O'Reilly, would go back to the site with a small team, including a doctor and some supplies. They gathered at 2:30 a.m. on Monday, left an hour before the sun came up, and arrived at the site by 11 in the morning. The group led by Mr. Buchanan, the farmer, included more than 100 people. They started work at dawn, clearing the path that led to the plateau where the 2 survivors were. The plan was to carry them down the track to safety. Both Binstead and Proud would have to spend one more night in the forest, but this time they would get a tent and medical care. When the sun rose on Tuesday morning, March 2nd, the journey down the plateau started. The group cleared a 14-mile path, and the survivors' condition was stabilized. 6 of the 7 passengers had now been found, except for one. His name was Jim Westray, and he had helped the others get off the plane before it caught fire during the accident. That fire had lasted 15 minutes, but it was put out by heavy rain, which continued until 10 the next morning. On Saturday, at 6:30 a.m., before the rain stopped, Westray stood up and said he could see a farm with some sheep in the distance. The other 2 guys tried to discourage him from going and told him there was nothing out there. Westray said he would go there to get help, and within 30 seconds he was gone. When O'Reilly arrived, he was asked by the 2 survivors if he had seen Westray, but O'Reilly was sure he hadn't made it. He followed Westray's path to a 40-foot-high waterfall and confirmed his theory that he hadn't survived. The operation was successful, and the 2 survivors made it. The story made national headlines, and there were broadcasts about it on TV. O'Reilly was presented with a plaque and a check raised from the public. Years later, O'Reilly's nephew, Peter, organized tours showing his uncle's journey to the site. The airplane involved was a Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine aircraft. On board, pilot Bruce Gurnon had 2 passengers, his father and business partner. They took off from Andros Island in the Bahamas and headed northwest for the Florida coast. It was December 4, 1970. If you draw up a map, trace a line connecting the island of Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Miami, and back to Bermuda, what do you get? Yes, it's a triangle, a sinister polygon known for mysteriously swallowing over 2,000 ships and 200 aircraft over the centuries. Bruce Gurnon's plane was within its hungry grasp. But this was a typical flight Bruce had made dozens of times before. The trip usually took about an hour and a half, with no hiccups or mysterious phenomena whatsoever. The men were no more concerned than you would be during your daily commute to work. Oh, but this time would be different. They would face very unusual circumstances indeed. Bruce took off and started gaining altitude. Strange things started happening right from the get-go. At an altitude of about 1,000 feet, he noticed a small cloud up ahead. But it kept growing. Not from the plane getting closer, this thing was actually getting bigger in size. Bruce had to fly through it, and he came out the other end just fine. Another mysterious cloud appeared at 11,500 feet. This one was massive, and Bruce had no other choice but to fly through it too. So he concentrated, took a deep breath, and in they went. At that moment, it got dark as night all around the aircraft. Not a single sliver of sunshine got through. But this wasn't a storm cloud, and it wasn't raining. Bruce was starting to get worried, and then, bam! He saw flashes of white light. They would appear and vanish quickly like lightning. But this pilot knew this certainly was no lightning. The flashes were so bright, they lit up the whole space around them. Bruce kept flying for another 30 minutes when he realized this was the same cloud he had gone through earlier when he started to climb. But now the cloud was cylindrical, and the plane was flying through its center. It was about 1 mile wide and seemed endless. Bruce thought he could never get out of that trap. But a minute later, he saw light at the end of the tunnel. He kept that yoke straight ahead. He was almost out of this nightmare. But all of a sudden, unexplainable things started happening again. The walls of the cloud tunnel began to narrow. They were closing in on the plane. The navigational instruments started wigging out. The compass was spinning by itself counterclockwise. The electronic instruments were all malfunctioning. It was like the plane was being operated by something else, or it was moving inside some kind of current. All of Bruce's attempts to take control were to no avail. He kept flying through that tunnel, bound and determined to get out of this thing and live to tell the tale. The walls kept narrowing, smaller and smaller, wrapping like a vortex. Bruce was running out of time. He had to get out of this place fast. The next 20 seconds were the most intense of his life. But then, he burst out of this foggy trap. As Bruce described later, he felt weightless for 5 seconds as his plane left the tunnel. The clouds dispersed, and now the aircraft was in a grayish haze. The men let out a big sigh of relief. He immediately grabbed the radio and contacted ground control. Bruce wanted them to determine his location. But when the dispatcher looked at the green screen, his face became contorted with confusion. Bruce's plane wasn't on the radar. It was as if the thing was invisible. But then the dispatcher said the aircraft was already in Miami airspace. Bruce was utterly shocked by this information. It just couldn't be true. The distance the Beechcraft was supposed to cover was about 250 miles. Remember, the whole trip usually took around 90 minutes. But this time, it took just 47 minutes to get to the destination. This model of aircraft can only cruise at about 180 miles per hour. Do the math, and anyone would understand that this was physically impossible. The dispatcher must have made a mistake. But when the clouds parted, Bruce saw that he really was over Miami. The plane landed safely, and it was time to try and solve this mystery. So what happened on that flight? Bruce checked the remaining fuel and his watch. After a short calculation, he was only more confused. The plane hadn't gone through the amount of fuel it should have. Bruce couldn't have been wrong. He was a very experienced pilot. By his early 20s, he already had 600 hours of flight under his belt, and he was all too familiar with this airspace he'd flown countless times. All the evidence in hand seemed to indicate that Bruce's plane just skipped over almost half the entire distance. The man thought about this bizarre occurrence for a long time. He even consulted with professors and experts, but none of them could give an exact answer to what happened that day. So he came up with his own theory and even wrote a book about it. Bruce thought it all came down to this electric fog with white flashes. Others, however, theorized that dark energy was responsible for this time leap. Yes, that same dark energy responsible for the expansion of the universe. This energy could have curved time-space like a black hole, forming this strange tunnel. Bruce accidentally hit it, but he was lucky to get out of there. That's how he got into Miami airspace so fast. But dark energy is just a theory attempting to explain the unexplainable. To this day, there is no real answer for how Bruce was able to travel that distance in such a short time. But some details still can be explained. Archive records show that 84 sunspots were recorded that day, as well as a huge solar wind moving almost 440 miles per second. This would cause disturbances in the Earth's magnetosphere that could throw off the plane's instruments and radars. So Bruce's version that he was in an electronic fog could be right. And about these weird clouds. The thing is, they're pretty commonplace things in this area. Zones with low and high pressure are constantly colliding there. The result? Storm clouds. Perhaps that cloud growing before Bruce's eyes was simply two massive air currents crashing into each other. But so far, no one has been able to explain how the plane got to Miami so fast. Well, maybe in the future the truth will be revealed. In the meantime, it remains another mysterious riddle of the Bermuda Triangle. But it's still by far not the most shocking incident there. In 1945, a total of 5 planes went missing in the Bermuda Triangle all at once. On December 5th, some Navy student pilots were training in the area. The day's lesson? Navigation. Ironically enough, they couldn't find their way back to the base and got lost. Many people assume they ran out of fuel. This is likely to have caused the incident, but the circumstances were very strange. The students were under the supervision of an experienced lieutenant who had 2,500 flight hours. He would never let a bunch of newbies go so far that they'd get lost. The incident was called Flight 19. Even now, there's a debate about how it could have happened. 3 years later, a passenger jet headed to Miami from Puerto Rico disappeared in the same area. There were 29 passengers and 3 crew members on board. The weather was clear throughout the flight. But experts believe that when the plane was about 50 miles off the coast of Miami, it could have been hit by a strong wind that knocked it off course. Years later, divers found a similar-looking plane in the waters. But since it was lacking certain details and registrations, no one could confirm that it was the missing Miami-bound aircraft. The next month, in January 1948, another plane went missing in Bermuda. 25 passengers and 6 crew members just vanished somewhere between Azores and Bermuda. The mystery of this plane's disappearance, along with countless others, remains unsolved.
An engine explodes during takeoff. The water injection system is switched off, and communication is lost. Now, this doomed plane faces the imminent threat of crashing into Athens or a hill. Will the captain be able to defy all odds and save over 400 lives on board? Stay tuned. It's 2 in the afternoon. A Boeing 747 starts rolling down the runway, picking up speed. Just as Captain Sifis Migadis lifts the nose of the aircraft, he's surprised by a loud bang. He has no idea what's just happened, but he's left with no options. The fully loaded plane is moving too fast to stop on the short runway space still left. The airplane begins its risky takeoff, and it's now heading straight for downtown Athens, which is absolutely crowded on a hot summer evening in August 9th, 1978. After the loud explosion, a flight attendant in the back takes the intercom and warns the crew about the catastrophic failure of engine number 3 located on the right side of the airplane. The flight attendant says, "I think we're screwed." And here's an honest, "Yeah, I know." The original plan of the Olympic Airways Flight 411 was a direct shot from Athens to New York. But now, this massive 370-ton jumbo jet simply doesn't have enough power to keep going up. The stress is through the roof. The flight is fully loaded with 18 crew members and 400 passengers, who are mostly U.S. citizens returning from their Greek summer vacation. Little do they know that the pilot still has to face 4 major problems in a 93-second period to ensure everyone stays alive. The first issue has to do with water injection. You see, this Boeing has 4 engines. Engine number 3 has just exploded, and engine number 2 is operating with reduced power after maintenance. So the pilot needs the remaining engines to give their all to get this plane climbing. The thing is, pushing the engines to the max creates a ton of heat. So, Captain Migadis asks the onboard flight engineer to double-check if the cooling system is on, preventing the engines from getting too hot and maintaining a safe temperature. It's a bit tricky to explain what went wrong at this point, but experts think that in the heat of the moment, the flight engineer might have gotten a little mixed up. Instead of ensuring the water injection is on, he does the opposite and switches the system off just 9 seconds after takeoff. This mistake further reduces the power in the engines, limiting the plane's ability to climb by causing a loss of 4,500 pounds of thrust. So now, the plane finds itself in a seriously bad situation, barely cruising over the rooftops at below minimum speed. The second issue with this doomed aircraft involves the landing gear. The 55-year-old pilot had already had over 30 years of experience when he was assigned to command this flight. So he decides to make a bold move by telling his co-pilot to pull up the wheels at 35 feet above the runway. This move isn't just risky, it's straight up against Boeing rules in situations like this. Pilots usually have to wait until the aircraft gains a bit more altitude to pull up the wheels, because popping those landing gear doors open for 15 seconds adds more resistance against the plane's forward motion. In other words, it basically slows the plane down. And that's why the co-pilot hesitates for a second before agreeing to break the rule. Against all odds, the 411 flight stays in the air, but the problems are far from over. This leads us to the third issue. The plane is getting dangerously close to hitting one of the oldest capital cities in the world, Athens. The flight started from Ellinikon International Airport. This was the main airport for the Greek capital for decades, and it was known as one of the trickiest and riskiest airports in the world. Picture this: 2 short runways, side by side, squeezed between the Aegean Sea and large mountains. Even though there were 2 runways, they mostly used just one, the one pointing planes straight at the center of Athens. Because of that, pilots had to make an immediate left turn right after takeoff, changing the flight path over the sea. Now you might be wondering, why doesn't Migadi's just turn left already? Well, the speed of the 747 is way lower than it should be at this point. If he makes a turn, the plane might descend even more, upping the chances of crashing right into the city. So, the captain decides to keep climbing, following a straight path while he's figuring out Plan B. Do you remember that the airport is surrounded by mountains? Well, this is problem number 4. The pilot knows that in about a mile, the airplane will face a hill that's about 200 feet tall. As Migadi's watches Pawnee Hill getting closer and closer, he decides to give up a few knots of airspeed to gain the altitude he desperately needs to fly over the hill. Migadi's feels relief when he sees that his risky plan has worked. The airplane flies over the hill with only 9 feet to spare. Yet, the relief fades quickly. He still needs to come up with an emergency landing plan. Imagine the cockpit eerily silent. They don't have contact with the tower anymore. While the 2 pilots are doing everything they can to keep Flight 411 from crashing, the flight engineer is still focused on fixing the problems with the engines. The terrain gets lower after the plane flies over Pawnee Hill, so the captain decides to lower the nose of the plane to trade a bit of altitude for speed. But nothing happens. In fact, the airplane's speed just keeps dropping, and they're barely exceeding an altitude of 200 feet. The plane is so low that it's even taking down some television antennas. It's around the height of a 14-story building named the Inter-American Tower. The airplane gets so close to that building that some flight attendants can actually see people's faces inside. A happy ending seems unreal as the plane is approaching a catastrophic collision with Mount Aigaleo, which is over 1,500 feet high. But suddenly, the engines kick in with more power and the plane starts picking up speed. Some specialists believe the acceleration was due to the combination of 3 things. The wind shifted, the temperature outside dropped, and the water injection system kicked back in. And the good news is that with more power in the engines, the pilot successfully gains altitude. By 2:05, Migadi's managed to turn left, avoiding a collision with Mount Aigaleo. The plane is heading towards the ocean. It keeps flying for over 30 minutes to dump fuel. The idea is to make the aircraft lighter before landing, as it's loaded with 160 tons of fuel needed for the transatlantic flight. After that, the captain brings the aircraft back to the same runway from which they took off, and they land safely at Ellinikon Airport. Everyone on board is safe, not a scratch on them, all thanks to this pilot who bravely broke the rules to save his crew and passengers. Now, picture the wild applause on the ground, and Migadi's daughters eagerly waiting for their father as he exits the plane. And it's no small feat, this pilot did the unthinkable. To put it in perspective, every Boeing simulation of this same flight ended in a crash. Migadi's impressive achievement led Olympic Airways to modify some of its procedures, and Boeing began to include a review of this case in its training curriculum. Now, you might be thinking that Migadi's was traumatized after this accident and never wanted to board an aircraft again. But nope. Remember, we're talking about a real hero. At 6 p.m. on that same day, Migadi's took his seat in the cockpit of a replacement Boeing 747 and flew 400 passengers over the Atlantic to New York. As for the aircraft, it stuck around with Olympic Airways for a couple of years until it joined Trans World Airlines in 1985. This 747 Boeing's career ended in 1997 after 24 years of service.
A plane with no identification marks is approaching the coast of Indonesia. It's not the most peaceful of times, and the flight operator is alarmed. 2 fighter jets take to the sky, about to take down the unidentified plane. It's all about to end in a disaster, when the fighters notice one strange detail. December 1st, 1941. Captain of a Boeing 314, Robert Ford and his team are preparing for one of the longest flights on one of the biggest planes in the world. The Boeing 314 Clipper California is a high-capacity seaplane. It has no landing gear, so it can only land on water. Its length is 100 feet, and its wingspan is 150 feet. This is more than a 6-story building, and on board this plane, there is a restaurant, resting areas, and even a room with a bed. Despite its size, the Clipper California can stay in the air for more than 18 hours. Captain Ford doesn't suspect what is awaiting him ahead. He gets on the plane. Their flight is bound from San Francisco to Auckland, New Zealand. The first stop is Los Angeles. There's no problem with this. The next stop is Pearl Harbor. The flight is going fine. December 7th, 1941. It's been 3 days since the plane left Pearl Harbor. The last final step of the journey remains: flight to New Zealand. At this moment, Captain Ford receives an order to return the plane to the nearest Allied base. The way back is closed, so the plane continues to fly to Auckland. The Clipper lands safely at the Auckland airport and receives an order that seems impossible. Robert Ford and his team must paint over all the registration and identification marks on the plane and deliver it to LaGuardia, New York. Then, fly across the world. This is an uncharted route with a length of 23,000 miles. In the entire history of aviation at this time, no one has flown such a distance. The team doesn't have maps or modern navigation devices. They don't know the lands they will fly over. They don't know who they may meet on their way and at which airports they will land. They must maintain and repair the plane themselves, extract fuel, and plot the route. At the same time, they have almost no money. Immediately after receiving the order, the team goes to the Auckland Library. They study all the atlases and maps to create a detailed flight plan. First, they need to get to Australia, then fly to Africa along the coast of Asia, and then they should go to the US. The crew paint all over the signs on the plane and prepare for takeoff. Fortunately, before the start, one banker finds about their situation and gives them $500. The plane takes off. The team didn't notice they forgot to paint over the American flag. In a few days, it will save their lives. Before Australia, they fly to New Caledonia to evacuate a group of people from there and deliver them to Australia. The operation is successful. In Australia, the team needs to refuel the plane. They don't find special transport for Clipper services at that airport, so the crew themselves transport 800 cans of gasoline. And here's an important detail. The Boeing 314 doesn't use conventional fuel. It needs to be filled with special high-octane aviation gasoline. Early in the morning, the Clipper takes off and heads to Indonesia. The flight is going fine. They are approaching the airport. Meanwhile, the captain of the base where the Clipper is supposed to land notices an unidentified plane. He doesn't know who's flying it and from where. No one warned him about it. It may be an enemy plane. 2 fighter jets take to the sky. They are approaching the Clipper and don't see any identification marks on its body. The pilots are about to attack, but at that moment, they notice an American flag. If Robert Ford hadn't forgotten to paint it over, then everything would have ended badly for him and his crew. The fighters allow landing. The Clipper lands on the water. A boat floats towards it to meet the plane's crew, but stops. It turns out the plane landed on a place filled with sea mines, so the boat doesn't dare to sail there. The Clipper approaches the port and miraculously avoids contact with mines. Robert Ford and the crew of the plane are well met. They are going too quickly to rest and hit the road. But then, a big problem surfaces. The plane is running out of fuel, and at that naval base, there is only ordinary automobile gas. Nobody knows if the plane engine is going to go with it. It may burn out or stop working altogether, but there's no choice. They fill the tanks with ordinary fuel. Captain decides to take off using the remnants of aviation fuel, and during the flight, they switch to tanks with ordinary gasoline. When this happens, the plane's engine begins to clap and rattle, but after a while, it calms down. The flight continues. For 19 hours, they fly on dangerous fuel. Their next stop is Ceylon. The sky is covered with clouds. The pilot doesn't see the coast in the airport, so he decides to lower the plane below the clouds. They fly at an altitude of 300 feet above the surface of the sea and notice a huge whale ahead. The plane flies closer, and it turns out it's not a whale. It's an enemy ship. The Clipper begins to gain altitude to hide back into the clouds. Finally, they are again surrounded by a white veil. The booms and blasts are heard behind and below the plane. The Clipper's flying with zero visibility for 60 minutes. Finally, the clouds are clearing and they see the port of Ceylon. The team makes a short stopover and proceeds with its journey. As soon as the plane takes off, one of the engines explodes. Fortunately, they didn't have time to fly far from the port, so they successfully landed the plane on the water and repaired the engine. The Clipper continues its mission. Now, Robert Ford's team flies mainly over land. This is very risky, since the aircraft doesn't have landing gear and it can't safely land on solid ground. Finally, they get to the Congo. The team has a great time here, gains strength, rests, and most importantly, gets high-octane aviation gasoline. Things are going great, but there's another ordeal ahead. Now, the aviators will have to make the longest flight in their journey. Their next stop is a port town in Brazil, and the distance to it is 3,500 miles across the ocean. The maximum flight distance of the Boeing is 3,700 miles. Any deviation from the course or a strong headwind can easily prevent the aircraft from reaching the port. Worried, the crew refill the tank and load additional fuel onto the plane. They leave the Congo, taking off along the narrow river. At this moment, the pilot notices the river ends a few miles away with a waterfall. The plane must urgently gain altitude, but it can't. The large amount of additional fuel bears the Clipper down. The waterfall is getting closer. In the last seconds, the plane manages to rise to the desired height. But even after the waterfall, Boeing still doesn't get high enough. It hovers right above the rocky coastal cliffs. A slight inclination can lead to a crash. Fortunately, they manage to pass unharmed. The plane rises to the perfect height. During the flight from the Congo to Brazil, the crew broke a new record. It's 23 hours and 35 minutes in the air. The tired crew make a long-awaited landing in the city of Natal. However, the rest doesn't last long. 2 hours later, they take to the air and head to the next stop, an airbase in Panama. January 6, 1942, 5:54 a.m. The already legendary Boeing 314 is approaching LaGuardia, New York. The team can't wait to finish their journey. They contact the dispatch, and he tells them they can't land the plane only after 7 a.m., since the air terminal starts working at this time. For an hour, Robert Ford and his crew are circling in the air. It was probably the longest hour of their lives. Finally, the mission is complete. The Boeing 314 becomes the first passenger plane to make an almost around-the-world trip. This long flight lasted more than a month. This plane spent 209 hours or 8 days in the air. During this time, it covered more than 30,000 miles and made 18 landings.
Do you know the feeling when you've been trying to solve one mystery for your entire life? Nope? Well, Detective Anderson does. During almost 30 years of working for the police, he solved many riddles, caught hundreds of robbers, and helped save thousands of lives. There's a huge number of successfully solved cases on his record. At the age of 25, he caught a thief who changed his own face with plastic surgery once a year. When Anderson was 30, prisoners started breaking from jails all over the world. The detective successfully solved this case. At the age of 38, he discovered the secret base of a forbidden order in a volcano's mouth. By his 50s, he managed to explain all the most inexplicable things in the world. But there was something he couldn't solve. These were two mysteries from the 50s. cases of missing planes. All these years, Anderson has been scrolling through the details of this puzzle. Unfortunately, he was too young when this story began. All he had were guesses and notes. But today, a sudden thought struck him. For the first time in many years, he felt that he could finally solve this mystery. But to do this, he had to immerse himself in this story again. So he opened the closet and pulled out 2 old magazines with detailed articles about these incidents. The first one happened in the summer of 1955. July 1st, Pan Am Flight 914 was about to depart from New York Airport with 61 people on board. The plane model was a Douglas DC-4. It differed from modern aircraft, having giant propellers instead of turbines. So, all passengers fastened their seatbelts. The plane started taxiing down the runway, sped up, and took off. It went high into the sky and out of sight. Its destination was Florida. The flight time would be 3 hours. Dispatching services were watching the plane on their radar when suddenly, Pan Am 914 disappeared. The operator tried to contact the pilot, but received no response. New York reported this to Florida. They said they couldn't see the plane either. Usually, pilots notify via radio if a plane crashes or gets into a storm. But this time, just nothing. After several unsuccessful attempts to establish the connection, they deployed large-scale search operations. Communication with the plane was interrupted when it was flying over the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, the air company had to admit the aircraft crashed into the water. But this version had no proof. When planes fall that way, rescuers find floating debris. Some parts of the cabin or luggage always get to the surface. This time, rescuers found nothing. The plane didn't transmit any distress signals and didn't leave any traces of the crash. It seemed like it just disappeared into thin air. People forgot about this disaster for 37 years. And then, something bizarre happened. 1992, Venezuela, Caracas Airport. The control tower received a signal about an unknown aircraft approaching them. It was weird because it wasn't supposed to be there. There were no flights scheduled for that time. The plane was landing. The dispatcher and the rest of the airport staff understood that something was wrong here. The plane looked old, with huge propellers instead of turbines. After landing, the pilot contacted the airport.
Where are we?
The dispatcher asked him to identify himself. A few seconds later, he received an answer.
We are Pan Am Flight 914 departed from New York to Florida with a crew of 4 people and 57 passengers on board.
The dispatcher didn't know what to do next. He and the airport staff understood what kind of plane they were looking at. What was this plane doing 37 years later and almost 1,240 miles away from its destination? After a few seconds, the startled dispatcher turned on the microphone and said,
It is September 9th, 1992. You know that?
A long pause followed. Then, the pilot responded in a panic.
Oh no. Jimmy, where are we? No! Stay away! Let's go now!
The airport staff saw the pilot waving his hands in horror through the glass. Then, he started the engines and took the plane to the runway. Pan Am 914 increased its speed and took off. The dispatcher tried to stop him, but the pilot didn't respond. The plane disappeared into the sky, and no one else had heard of it since that day. Detective Anderson finished reading the article. He frowned and looked out the window. Raindrops were hitting the glass. The storm outside perfectly depicted what was happening in his mind at that moment. He seemed to know what had happened to that plane. All the clues were there, lying right in front of his eyes. But to know for sure, Anderson had to move on to the next case. It was another article, dated 1989. It happened in 1954. Santiago Airlines Flight 513 took off from West Germany Airport. The plane was due to land in Brazil in 18 hours. There were 88 passengers and 4 crew members on board. The plane hid behind the clouds and disappeared from all radar. Air traffic controllers were trying to contact the pilots, but didn't receive a response. 18 hours later, they called the airport in Brazil. Those dispatchers couldn't confirm this plane's landing and couldn't contact the pilots either. The search operation lasted for several months, but they found nothing. Just like in the Pan Am 914 case, the plane disappeared from radar while flying over the Atlantic Ocean. 2 years later, the search operation ended, and Santiago Airlines ceased its activities. October 12, 1989. Airport controllers in Brazil noticed a passenger plane that suddenly appeared on their radar. It didn't answer the airport staff's questions and just circled over the airbase. After a few minutes, the plane landed and nothing. No one opened the ramp. Passengers didn't get out. Pilots didn't respond. The aircraft was in perfect condition. One of the dispatchers realized that this was the missing Santiago Airlines Flight 513 that had been considered lost for 35 years. Airport staff approached the plane and opened the doors. What they saw there terrified them. The police, customs staff, doctors, detectives, and other airport staff members gathered around the plane. No one knew what to do next. There was no living person on board who could tell the truth. The plane disappeared in 1954 and appeared 35 years later in perfect condition without any damage. So far, no one has figured out what happened. Detective Anderson noticed the stories were very similar. Pan Am 914 disappeared in 1955. Santiago Airlines 513 vanished in 1954. The difference was almost a year. Anderson scratched his head and noticed another little detail. Both planes went missing from the radar the moment they were flying over the Atlantic Ocean. There are many myths about phantom ships and mysterious phenomena connected with the Bermuda Triangle. Detective Anderson knew these tales, but these two missing planes puzzled him. He looked at two articles and understood everything. Exactly. The solution was there, right in front of his eyes. Both stories were written in the same newspaper. There was no real dispatcher who communicated with the planes. Nothing was known about the passengers. No newspapers except this one published news about these missing aircraft. It seemed they just took the same story and changed the dates, locations, and names of flights. Yes, the case was solved. It was all fake. The rain stopped. Detective Anderson looked out the window and heard the sound of a passing train. He remembered another weird and fake story. A story about a phantom train. It took place in Italy in 1911. 100 passengers boarded the train of the Zanetti Railway Company. It went through the picturesque mountainous area, got into a mountain tunnel, and disappeared. No one else had seen the train since then. All the passengers were lost, but not for long. They appeared in the past. There were records dated 1845. One unknown doctor from Mexico City wrote about 100 Italians who appeared in the city from nowhere. They were all dressed strangely and talked about one mysterious train. This was a completely made-up story. There was no proof or records about this train and the people who got into the past. A loud sound interrupted his thoughts. Detective Anderson picked up the phone. He was silently listening to the person on the other end of the line. A minute later, he answered, "Yes." The detective put the phone down. It was a new mystery for him. In the Sahara Desert, the locals noticed a huge ship lost in the South Pacific 27 years ago. There was no crew on board, no cargo, and no flags. No one knew how it appeared among the sand, but wet mud formed around it because of moisture. It seemed like the ship had just teleported there from the water. Perfect! No fakes this time. Detective Anderson put on his hat and left the office. But this story is for another video.
Hey, look at this stunning futuristic interior. It's a long studio room with a low ceiling, white walls, and windows overlooking the forest. And there's also a large panoramic window in the corner. You can easily invite hundreds of guests here, and they will all be impressed. So what, would you like to buy or rent this spot? Oh, there's another minor nuance. This house is an airplane. Unfortunately, you can only fly somewhere on it if you invest a couple of $1 million for repairs, but it's possible to live here. A resident of Oregon, Bruce Campbell, created this place. He turned a giant Boeing 727 into his home, where he spends about 6 months every year. Bruce installed 2 bathrooms and a shower, made a kitchen, and equipped this place with electricity. It has everything you need for a comfortable stay. But the most incredible thing is that you can create precisely the same house. To understand how to do this, let's look at Bruce's story. As a teenager, he was watching TV when he saw a report of an aircraft boneyard. These iron birds amazed him and inspired him to create a new home. Growing up, Bruce began to study electrical engineering and always remembered his teenage dream. In the 70s, he bought 10 acres of land in the woods near the town of Hillsboro, Oregon. This area is approximately equal to 8 football fields. After that, he began to look for a plane. In 1999, he hired a rescue company to help him find a Boeing. Soon, they found a 200-seat passenger aircraft in Greece. Since the plane was already out of order and no one would fly it, Bruce bought it for little money. It was just $100,000. The amount is small, considering that a new Boeing costs about $100 million. Airport staff removed the engine and fuel from the plane, disassembled it, and sent it to Oregon. After the logistics problems were solved and the plane ended up in the woods, Bruce began to turn it into a house. The repair work lasted several years. When everything was ready, the media found out about Bruce and made him a celebrity. He showed that even such gigantic things as an airplane could be recycled. Bruce invites anyone to his house to show that airplanes can be used for cheap housing. The advantages of such a house are that the airplane's outer layer can protect from cold, moisture, wind, and sun. Every year in the US, several hundred aircraft break down. People transport them to the aircraft boneyard, where these planes are waiting for repairs or turning into scrap metal. And many of them are in good condition. Another unusual house is located in Tokyo, Japan. It's definitely not your choice if you go to relax alone or think that home is a place where no one can bother you. Welcome to the transparent house. It looks pretty stylish. There are huge panoramic windows without curtains and no walls and doors between the rooms. There are a bunch of large shelves and ladders inside. You can climb, jump, and hang here. The height of the house is 3 floors. It looks like a modern urban tree house. This place is open to everyone. And now, take a look at the most fantastic tree house. Can you see it? No? No wonder. This house is almost invisible in the forest because of its mirrored surface. It's called Mirror Tree House and is located in Sweden. At night with the lights off, this small building completely merges with nature. Now turn on the lights in the windows and take a closer look. This is a stylish and modern building where anyone can spend the night. You need to pay for it though because it's a hotel. Here's another tree house. More precisely, it's a huge building built on several trees. It's called Minister's Tree House and is located in Crossville, Tennessee. It's considered to be the biggest treehouse in the world. It's built from recycled wood. It occupies almost 5 floors in height and has several rooms. If elves lived in the forest, then this house would be their bank or the administration of the woods. Let's get down from the trees to the ground, more precisely, under the ground. It's not even a house, but a small town. And every building here is pretty unusual. You won't see this town from the outside. All houses, cafes, post offices, and other buildings are located in the pits from which pipes protrude, releasing steam. Welcome to Coober Pedy, Australia. Enter any house and see that there is ground instead of the usual walls and wallpaper. Such unusual architecture is because this place is the world's largest reserve of opal. Most of these minerals, which are sold all over the world, are mined in this city. Opal was first found in these lands in 1915. Since then, people have been coming here to search for precious stones. There are no mining companies here because it's impossible to determine large deposits of opal with the help of technology. Therefore, people mine it manually with picks and shovels. This work is quite long and difficult. So, the town residents rent a place where they dig and build a house. Spread your arms in different directions. That's the width of our next house. The distance from one wall to the other is less than the length of your body. It looks tiny, but people are happy to live here. Welcome to the Current House. The narrowest house in the world is located in Poland. On the streets of Warsaw, you will easily notice it. It's like it's stuck between two buildings. Everything is pretty cute and stylish inside. The white interior adds a feeling of extra space. The Current House serves as a transit point for travel writers. If you're working on a book, this place will be a great source of inspiration for you. This house looks like something from another planet. It's called Robert Bruno's Steel House. It stands on 4 legs, has a strangely shaped window, and is made of metal. This strange house is located in Ransom Canyon, Texas. This is the creation of the sculptor Robert Bruno. He built it from the 70s until 2008. He used about 150 tons of blackened steel and made every detail by hand. Unfortunately, the sculptor passed away before he could complete his masterpiece. There's a toilet house in South Korea, close to Seoul. This big building looks like a giant toilet bowl. It's made of steel, white concrete, and glass. The purpose of this house is to promote the hygiene and sanitation of toilets. Many diseases are spread because of poor cleaning. Inside the toilet, you will find 2 guest rooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bathrooms. And to rent the whole building, you need to pay about $50,000. Looking at this house in one of the alleys of London, it may seem to you that the building is about to fall apart. The house was built in the 16th century and originally didn't look like this. But in 1687, the city council ordered the demolition of the building to free space for something else. The house was almost destroyed, but its owner sued the city council. He won the case and the council was obliged to restore the house. But they did it in a hurry, using cheap materials. For many years, the wood has been bending and the house has got such an unusual shape. Let's end our realtor's journey with this fun house. People who love skateboarding will be delighted to visit this place. Welcome to Skateboard House Malibu, California. You don't leave your home to start riding. The whole house has a circular curved shape and there's no corners in it. There are beds and tables here, which you can also use for tricks.
The plane had been in the air for a mere 25 seconds when the pilots noticed weird noises and bizarre vibrations. They tried several ways to improve the situation, but nothing worked. The engine surges continued, and just over a minute into the flight, when the plane reached 3,000 feet, both engines failed. First the right one, 2 seconds later the left one. The pilots decided to return to the airport they had just left. At the same time, they tried to restart the engines. Nothing seemed to work. The flight crew made a decision to pitch the plane down and then level it off. Perhaps it could help them gain some speed for the glide. But soon, they realized they wouldn't make it to the airport. Was the plane going to crash? That's when the miracle at Gotrura occurred. The morning before the flight started as usual. Regular pre-flight procedures, good weather. The members of the flight crew were experienced pilots. A 44-year-old Danish captain with over 8,000 flight hours under his belt, and a 34-year-old first officer from Sweden with 3,000 hours. So, what could go wrong? The plane itself was almost brand new. It was a McDonnell Douglas MD-81 nicknamed Dana Viking. It made its first flight on March 16, 1991. By that fateful day, the aircraft had been in service for a mere 9 months. There were 122 passengers and 7 crew members on board. Flight 751 Scandinavian Airlines was a scheduled flight from Stockholm, Sweden to Warsaw, Poland. On the way, the plane was supposed to make a stop in Copenhagen, Denmark. The aircraft took off from Stockholm according to its schedule at 8:47 a.m. local time. But by that point, the people inside had already been doomed. all because of a terrible sequence of events before the departure. It started the night before. The plane arrived at Stockholm Airport after a flight from Zurich. It was 10:09 p.m. The aircraft spent the night at the gate outside. It was cold. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. What made the situation even worse was that almost 6,000 pounds of freezing cold fuel, chilled during the night, still remained in the tanks located in the wings. The fuel was so cold because the plane had been flying at the cruising altitude, where the air temperature outside the cabin varied from -61 to -80 degrees. The flight from Zurich lasted around 1 hour and 40 minutes. Soon after midnight, a flight technician came to check on the aircraft. The man had to remove some slush from the landing gear, otherwise he wouldn't be able to examine it. At around 2 a.m., when he was leaving, he noticed some ice covering the upper part of the wings. By the morning, the situation had become even dire. A layer of clear, almost invisible ice had formed on the tops of the wings. The plane had to leave the gate at around 8:30 a.m. An hour before the departure, the mechanic responsible for the plane noticed that some ice covered the underside of the wings. He decided to make sure there was no ice on the tops of the wings. He climbed a ladder and put one knee on the wing. Then he bent forward to touch the front part of the wing. There was no ice, just some slush. The mechanic decided to make sure everything was fine with the air inlet of one of the engines. He didn't find anything abnormal. Soon after that, the personnel used more than 220 gallons of de-icing fuel to remove ice from the plane. The mechanic consulted with the captain of the aircraft and ordered the staff to de-ice the underside of the wings as well. After all, he had seen some ice there. But no one thought to double-check if there was clear ice on the tops of the wings. After they had finished the procedure, the mechanic reported to the captain, "We're done here. De-icing finished. There was a lot of snow and ice, but everything's clear now." The captain thanked the mechanic and carried on with the pre-flight procedures. The plane taxied to the runway. Its engine's anti-ice systems were switched on and didn't show any malfunction. But several passengers later claimed they had seen ice sliding off the upper side of the wings while the plane had been taking off. And still, the plane left the ground and headed for Stockholm as usual. But shortly after the takeoff, several pieces of the overlooked ice broke off. At full speed, they slammed into the fans of the engines near the tail on both sides of the plane, ruining the blades. It led to a series of surges, and the rest is history. Meanwhile, somewhere in the cabin, Scandinavian Airlines flight captain Per Holmberg, who was on board as a passenger, noticed something was amiss. At first, he informed the flight attendant sitting in the rear jump seat that the right engine was surging. She tried to contact the flight crew, unsuccessfully. Then, the ununiformed captain rushed to the cockpit and asked if he could help the pilots. The first officer gave him the emergency checklist, and the captain asked him to start the auxiliary power unit, a small gas turbine in the tail of the plane. Holmberg's advice and help were invaluable, but was it enough to save the plane and the people inside? When the plane emerged from the cloud cover at an altitude of 890 feet, the pilots realized they wouldn't have enough time to make it back to the airport. An immediate emergency landing was unavoidable. The assisting captain passed the order to the cabin crew, and they started preparing the passengers. There was a large field to the north of the plane, but the captain realized they didn't have enough time to reach it. So he chose a much smaller field in a forested area in the direction of flight. It was not far from the village of Gotrura in Uppland, Sweden. The plane was just 1,300 feet above the ground when the assisting captain started extending the flaps. At a height of 183 feet, the captain reported to Stockholm Control, "We're crashing to the ground." 7 seconds later, the plane hit several trees and lost a huge chunk of its right wing. By that time, the landing gear had already been extended and the speed had decreased to 139 miles per hour. Moments later, the plane's tail struck the ground and broke off. The aircraft kept sliding across the field, still at high speed. It traveled 360 feet, with its main landing gear leaving marks on the field. At one point, the plane lost the main and nose landing gear. Its fuselage broke into 3 parts. Miraculously, there was no fire. If you look at the pictures from the crash site, the plane torn into pieces, with its parts scattered across the field, it's hard to believe that all 129 people on board the plane survived. It seems like a miracle, but it was also thanks to the flight attendants' quick reaction and the correct instructions they gave the passengers. They didn't panic and told the people to adopt the brace position just in time to avoid fatalities. Even more surprising, almost all passengers, except for 4 people, made their way out of the plane on their own. No wonder this accident was nicknamed the Miracle. The aircraft, though, wasn't as lucky. The 9-month-old plane was damaged so badly that it was an immediate write-off. Everyone praised the actions of the flight crew. The landing was incredibly skilled, especially in such a fast-developing, very dangerous situation. The captain himself admitted that few pilots were ever forced to put to the test the skills they got during training, at least not to this degree. He said he was proud of his crew and relieved that everyone had survived, and he never returned to piloting commercial planes. Pan American Flight 6 was finishing an around-the-world trip with several stops on its way. On October 16, 1956, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, dubbed Sovereign of the Skies, left Honolulu and was heading for San Francisco. It was the flight's last leg, but no one could predict this phrase would turn out to be not just a figure of speech. The plane had to start its journey at 7:30 p.m., but some maintenance issues delayed boarding for almost an hour. The passengers were getting a bit impatient. The plane finally took off at 8:26 p.m. and soon reached the altitude of 13,000 feet. For some time, the aircraft was experiencing turbulence, which made it impossible to serve dinner. Several hours later, the lights were dimmed and the passengers stretched across empty seats preparing to have a peaceful sleep. Little did they know that sleep was the last thing they were going to get that night. At about 1 a.m., the cockpit crew got permission to climb to 21,000 feet, but once the aircraft reached the needed height, a terrible thing happened. At 1:20 a.m., one of the plane's engines started to overspeed. George Hacker, the first officer flying the plane, tried to deal with this problem by slowing the plane down. It didn't work out. This made Captain Richard Ogg cut off the oil supply to the engine altogether. After a while, the engine conked out, but its propeller kept windmilling in the airstream. It caused the aircraft to start losing precious fuel and seriously slowed down its speed. The plane was moving far too slowly now, just 174 miles per hour. It was also losing altitude at an alarming pace, at the rate of 1,000 feet per minute. The 3 remaining engines were struggling, trying to decrease the breakneck speed of the descent. At least, they were still functioning. It made the pilots feel somewhat hopeful. But all of a sudden, the captain noticed that the 4th engine started to fail. It was producing just a bit of power, even though it was working at full throttle. At 2:45 a.m., the unavoidable happened. The 4th engine started to backfire, and the pilots had to shut it down. Now the plane had only 2 working engines and was moving more and more slowly. The crew calculated how much fuel the aircraft was consuming, and a heavy silence filled the cockpit. The pilots had nothing to do but face the awful truth. The plane didn't have enough fuel to reach San Francisco. Neither could it return to Honolulu. Captain Ogg sent a radio message to the U.S. Coast Guard. Pan Am 90943, Flight 6, declares an emergency over the Pacific. At that time, a Coast Guard cutter was always on patrol between Hawaii and the California coast. Such ships passed on radio messages to the nearest airplanes and provided them with weather information. They were usually placed near the points of no return. Those were the areas where a plane would have already burned so much fuel that it wouldn't have a chance to turn back if something went wrong. That night, the Coast Guard cutter was the 255-foot Pontchartrain, and William Earl was the commander. The plane headed toward the ship and leveled off at an altitude of 2,000 feet. Then it started to fly above the ship in 8-mile circles, waiting for daylight. It was crucial to see the surroundings because the pilots had to keep the aircraft's wings level with the ocean, and it would be impossible in the dark. During the day, it would also be easier to rescue all the passengers. The captain's decision to ditch the plane carrying 24 passengers and 7 crew members wasn't an easy or hurried one. He had to weigh numerous factors. Should I get rid of the fuel to make the plane lighter? Should I land now or wait until daylight and better visibility? But one thing was crystal clear. Having lost 2 engines, the plane was burning the fuel too fast. There was no other solution but to ditch into the ocean. As the Stratocruiser was circling the Coast Guard cutter, it managed to climb from 2,000 to 5,000 feet. It caused the plane to consume more fuel and become lighter, which was a good thing. The lighter the aircraft, the longer it would float on the surface. Plus, it lowered the risk of fire after a crash landing. The captain knew about an accident that had happened with another Pan Am Stratocruiser. That time, the plane's tail broke off. That's why Captain Ogg asked the passengers in the back to move toward the front part of the plane. Those who were sitting by the engines had to relocate too. Flight attendants removed all loose objects in the cabin and explained to the passengers what to expect. Since the problem started, the crew members had been doing their best to calm down the terrified people. When the passengers found out the plane was going to circle and wasn't landing in the dark, they were hugely relieved. Another comforting thought was that the Coast Guard cutter was out there, ready to provide them with as much help as possible. Luckily, the weather was good, and the ocean was very calm. At 5:40 a.m., Captain Ogg informed the cutter he was ready to ditch. The ship left a thick foam path in the water to help the pilots understand their height above the surface more clearly. At 6:15 a.m., the plane touched down. It was still moving at a speed of 105 miles per hour. It had already traveled several hundred feet along the surface and started to slow down when the worst possible thing happened. One of the wings hit a wave, the aircraft rotated nearly 180 degrees, and its tail broke off. After that, in a matter of seconds, the plane's nose went under the water. One of those who had been on board the plane said later that all he could see at that terrifying moment was water. It seemed to be everywhere. But after less than a minute, it started to recede. The front of the plane resurfaced. People on the Pontchartrain were staring at the disaster unfolding in front of their eyes, feeling numb. They were devastated. No one could possibly survive such a crash landing. But they were very, very wrong. All 31 people on board the plane were alive. Even more astonishingly, there had been just a couple of minor injuries. Once those on board the Pontchartrain realized the passengers and crew had survived, several rescue boats rushed toward the wreckage. Meanwhile, the captain and those passengers who had been assigned to help with the evacuation quickly deployed 3 life rafts. But when people started to climb on one of them, it became obvious the raft hadn't inflated properly. It started to sink. Luckily, the rescue boats were on time. They promptly transferred the passengers from the damaged raft to the cutter. At 6:35 a.m., the last piece of the wreckage vanished in the waves. By that time, all the people from the aircraft had already got to the safety of the Coast Guard ship. They stayed in the cutter's officers' quarters and reached San Francisco several days later. Pan American Flight 6 crash landing was the first accident when an airliner ditched into the ocean but managed to keep everyone on board safe. And the whole blood-curdling event was captured on camera. Life rafts bobbing by the plane's side, survivors being transferred to the rescue boats, the plane rapidly sinking and disappearing among waves. Sometime later, all the crew members got awards for tackling the emergency and keeping the passengers safe. Captain Richard Ogg was the first person to receive the Civilian Airmanship Award presented for the most outstanding skills and heroism. Her name is Lillian Boyer. Wait a minute, why is she standing on the wing of an airplane? Well, from 1921, Lillian made a living doing completely crazy mid-air stunts on planes. She really knew how to put on a good show, and she became famous all over the United States. But Lillian started her unusual career completely by accident. She was a regular 21-year-old waitress at a Chicago restaurant. That changed when two pilots named Elmer Partridge and Johnny Metzger became frequent customers there. One day, they offered Lillian a ride in their old biplane, a Curtiss JN-4D Jenny. She agreed, and they headed over to the local airport. Soon, Lillian was in the air. It was the first flight of her life, and she was incredibly excited. Flying didn't scare her at all. In fact, with a strong wind blowing in her face and the noise of the engine ringing in her ears, Lillian realized that planes were her calling. 4 days later, Partridge asked her if she wanted to take another flight. This time, Lillian decided to do something bold. When the plane was flying at 65 miles an hour, she got out of her seat and stood on the wing. But even then, she wanted more. So she walked all the way to the edge. The whole time, Partridge was screaming at her to sit down because he thought she was going to jump. She could barely hear his voice because of the engine noise. But Lillian wasn't scared at all. She actually enjoyed it. When the pilot saw what she could do, he introduced her to Billy Brock. He worked at the Chattanooga airport and was looking for someone who could do tricks on the wing of a plane. They shook hands and soon got started on Lillian's training. Lillian quit her restaurant job and started training full-time. For 5 months, she practiced doing stunts in a barn at Chattanooga. She used a model plane which had soft mattresses placed underneath it for safety. She did gymnastics with an instructor, as well as running and other sports, and she changed her eating habits. Soon, she was ready for a real flight. And she proved she was the best. Lillian was the first female stunt person to perform tricks like hanging from a plane using one hand or hanging by her knees or ankles. Her bravery amazed people, and she quickly became very popular. She and Brock started doing air shows at various fairs and festivals, and she turned into a real star. When they came to town, the crowd always recognized them. There was always a car waiting for Lillian, and she had a lot of passionate fans. Lillian was the only woman at the time who could perform one very risky stunt. She would get out of the cockpit holding a thin wire, which had a mouthpiece at the end of it. She would do a few tricks on the edge of the wing and then hang under the plane holding on by only her teeth. The spectators couldn't see the wire from hundreds of feet below, so it looked both pretty shocking and amazing. The crowd would erupt into screams when Lillian performed this trick. Then Brock would lower a special ladder and she'd grab it and go back to her seat. But there were also accidents. These reminded Lillian and Brock that they were engaged in a very dangerous business and that they had to be as careful as possible. During one of their shows in 1924, they planned to do an unusual trick. Brock was going to do a loop while Lillian was standing on the biplane's top wings. The idea was for her to slip her feet into some straps, and the centrifugal force of the loop would help Lillian keep her balance. But during the actual trip, something went wrong and the strap broke. Lillian smashed really hard into the wing, but she still managed to climb back into her seat. She was injured, but she kept on doing her shows. When she was performing in Trenton, New Jersey, in October 1925, Lillian had another 3 accidents during some parachute jumps. On the first day of the show, the wind took her away from her landing spot and she fell onto the seat of a Ferris wheel. Some of the audience thought it was just another crazy stunt, but it was actually a very dangerous situation. Luckily, the Ferris wheel operator realized that Lillian was in trouble and stopped the ride. The second time, she couldn't control her chute and struck the roof of the grandstand. She hit it hard and got stuck there, and people had to look for a ladder to help Lillian down. On the third day of her show, Lillian's parachute almost landed on a tent, so she pulled on the shrouds as hard as she could to change direction. But this made the parachute turn inside out, and Lillian fell about 50 feet straight into the ground. She suffered a lot of injuries and had to be hospitalized, but she was treated very well. She was in the hospital for 2 months, and all of her bills were paid by an anonymous person. Lillian thought it was probably the president of the fair. He liked her. In fact, since she was a star, a lot of men admired her. But she didn't risk her life for money or fame. Lillian did all this for herself. Brock got almost all the money from their performances, and that was her decision. They usually perform for 2 or 3 days straight, or even a whole week. They were paid $1,000 to $1,200 for one performance, but Lillian only got $100. As she said herself, that was a decent amount of money, and it was enough for her. So Brock ran the business, maintained the plane, and hired mechanics and crew. But their show was called Lillian Boyer's Flying Circus, and there was a reason for that. Brock was in love with Lillian. Constantly working together made the two of them close. It didn't work out though. Lillian told him that there wouldn't be anything between them. But he still cared about her, and Lillian really appreciated him for that. She trusted her pilot with her life, and she admired his skill. In fact, she said he was the best pilot she ever knew. Before every flight, he double-checked all the systems, wires, and mechanisms. He would tell her where to go, and Lillian would listen to him. And it was Brock who came up with most of the tricks. There was total trust between them, and they worked as one. After Brock passed away, Lillian kept doing stunts with another pilot, but she couldn't trust him like she had trusted Brock. One of her signature tricks was switching from a car to a plane, but she never did it with the new pilot. During her stunt career between 1921 and 1928, Lillian performed 352 shows in 41 U.S. states and Canada. She performed 143 changes from a car to a plane and made 37 parachute jumps. But in 1928, low-altitude flying was banned, and so dangerous stunts performed on the wings of airplanes became history. Almost half a century later, Lillian once again became a celebrity at the San Diego Aerospace Museum. An entire section of it was devoted to her incredible achievements. Lillian was the guest of honor at all the events there. One evening, she was given one of the most pleasant surprises of her life. It was a flight on a Boeing PT-17 biplane. This time, now in her 80s, Lillian didn't walk on the wings or perform dangerous stunts. But when she landed, she admitted that she really wanted to. The pilot had told her not to get out of the cockpit. Plus, she couldn't trust him as much as she had trusted Brock.
Have you ever watched an action-packed Hollywood film where an airplane gets a hole in its side and everyone starts freaking out? Stuff starts flying all over the place and people are barely staying in their seats. Well, in real life, a small hole in the plane's body isn't going to cause that much drama. However, I have an incredible story to tell you about a pilot who actually managed to land a plane with half of its roof missing. Can you believe it? Make sure your seatbelt is fastened because this one is going to be a wild ride. On April 28, 1988, a Boeing 737 owned by Aloha Airlines took off from Hilo International Airport en route to Honolulu. Before this flight, the plane had already flown 3 short trips from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. Everything was chill that day, and the weather was nice and calm. It looked like smooth sailing all the way. The captain of the flight was Robert Schornsteimer, and the co-pilot was Madeline Tompkins, both experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours in the Boeing 737. Bright and early that morning, before taking off from Honolulu, Madeline did the regular pre-flight inspection and said that everything was good to go. At 11 a.m., they took off from Honolulu and went to Maui, then Hilo. When they got to Hilo, they didn't leave the cockpit or check the plane from the outside. It wasn't a requirement, so why bother? At 1:25 p.m., the plane took off for the final leg of the round trip, with 95 people on board. 89 passengers, 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and an FAA traffic controller who sat in the observer seat in the cockpit. The plane had taken off like normal and reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet without any hiccups. But then, 26 miles from Kahului, things went totally haywire. The pilots heard a loud whooshing sound, followed by a crack, and then a rush of wind that was so loud it was deafening. Turns out, a small section of the roof on the left side had come loose, causing the plane to decompress explosively. And to make matters even worse, the decompression caused a chain reaction that led to a huge chunk of the plane's roof ripping off completely. That missing part was a massive 18.5 feet long and was part of the skin that covered the plane from the cockpit all the way back to the forewing area. The pilots didn't have a clue what was going on when the disaster struck. The first officer, who was the one in charge of the plane at that time, suddenly felt her head snap back, and then she saw a bunch of gray insulation and debris flying around the cockpit like it was a tornado. Meanwhile, the captain took a look around and was shocked to see that the cockpit door was nowhere to be seen, and instead of the first-class ceiling, he was staring straight up at the sky. The plane started to tilt from side to side, making it challenging to keep it under control. The crew in the cockpit quickly put on their oxygen masks, and the captain took over control of the plane. He then initiated an emergency descent towards the nearest airport on Maui Island. Luckily, all the passengers were seated, and most of them had their seatbelts fastened since the seatbelt sign was still on. Unfortunately, the 3 flight attendants were caught off guard. One of them was near the hole and was pulled out of the plane. The other 2 were thrown to the floor, with one of them hitting her head hard and losing consciousness. The third attendant tried to help the passengers and keep them calm. At the same time, the pilots were desperately trying to let air traffic control know that they were in trouble. But there were communication problems even between themselves due to the loud noise and the fact that they were wearing oxygen masks. They had to resort to hand signals to understand each other. Moreover, they were unsure whether their messages were being heard by ATC. The plane's controls were not responding properly, which made the captain's job of flying the plane even harder. The first officer was doing her best to assist the captain and communicate with the tower. It was only after the plane descended to an altitude of 14,000 feet that the controller finally received their distress call and immediately started making arrangements for an emergency landing. The control tower wasn't prepared for a situation like this, though. In fact, the tower had to call 911, just like any other regular person would do in case of an emergency. The problem was that the controller didn't understand the severity of the situation, and they didn't realize that the passengers and crew members would need medical help. This was because the crew had only reported a rapid decompression and hadn't explained the entire situation in detail. The plane was in a very bad mess, but the captain was doing everything he could to safely land the plane. As they descended towards the airport, the captain commanded the first officer to lower the landing gear, but the indicator light didn't turn on. The plane also had an issue with the left engine, which failed as they approached the runway. Despite these problems, the captain used the reverse thrust of the working engine to try and land the plane. It was a difficult and dangerous task, but they managed to land the plane safely on the runway. The passengers and crew members were then evacuated from the plane. It was a miracle that everyone survived. However, 65 people were injured. They had been hit by debris and pieces of the plane's body that were flying around. Unfortunately, the ground staff wasn't aware of the severity of the situation and didn't have enough resources to provide immediate medical assistance to the injured passengers. The first ambulance arrived 7 minutes after the plane landed, which wasn't an ideal scenario. Furthermore, there were only 2 ambulances on the entire island, which couldn't accommodate all the injured people. As a result, tour vans were used to transport the passengers to the hospital. Fortunately, 2 drivers who were former paramedics provided immediate first aid to the injured right on the runway. Meanwhile, the airport mechanics and office staff took the vans to the hospital, which was located 3 miles away. Despite the chaotic and stressful circumstances, only 8 people suffered severe injuries, but they all later made a full recovery. The plane was in really bad shape though, and it was no wonder it couldn't handle the stress of the decompression incident. Despite its age not being a problem, it had experienced a whole lot of takeoffs and landings, which took a toll on its integrity. The salty and humid environment it operated in only added to the damage. You see, planes are designed to withstand a certain number of flight cycles, and this plane had exceeded that number by a long shot. The majority of its flights were short domestic ones, which meant it had to take off and land way more times than it was designed for. This is what ultimately led to the roof coming off during the flight. The poor condition of the plane meant that it was beyond repair and had to be dismantled right there at the airport. What's interesting is that in an interview after the accident, One passenger recalled that she had noticed a crack in the plane's fuselage while she was boarding. She didn't tell the flight crew about it because she didn't think it was worth it, so they didn't know to check it. It's important to remember that these types of accidents are very rare nowadays. Major airlines and airports take numerous steps to ensure safety. And according to Harvard University, the chances of being in an airplane accident are about 1 in 1.2 million. That's a tiny percentage, and I don't know about you, but I find that very comforting. And even if something did happen, such as the roof of the plane coming off, it's reassuring to know that the pilots are trained to handle emergencies and can still land the plane safely.
You unbuckle your seatbelt and stand up, stretching your legs after a long flight. You head towards the restroom and think about freshening up. Suddenly, you're in the air. Luggage flies around you. It feels like the world is ending. You're 30,000 feet above the ground, and you're heading for a crash landing. Before you have any more time to think, everything goes black. In early 2001, a massive Boeing 747 carrying over 400 people took off from Tokyo Haneda International Airport. The flight progressed like normal until it reached 39,000 feet and coasting speed. Food was being served, and passengers were up and about like they would be on any other journey. Slightly earlier in the day, a Japanese airline flight between Busan, South Korea, and Tokyo, Japan, had begun in a similar fashion. This one was smaller, with about 250 people on board. It had also started coasting at around 37,000 feet. Both of these planes were on a similar flight path, only 2,000 feet apart, and due to meet over the Japanese island of Honshu. They were both close to this intersection when the pilot of the Boeing 747 noticed his anti-collision indicator going off. This was when he first knew something was wrong. One of the critical aspects of modern air travel is the coordination of air traffic control. Every flight is monitored, and pilots are advised if anything goes wrong. The entire point of air traffic control is to organize flights so well that collisions are impossible. Every modern plane is built with collision monitors, but they are never supposed to be used because of this. While the anti-collision indicators buzzed, 26-year-old trainee Hideki Hachitani was sitting behind the radars at the control tower, monitoring both flights. The stress of having to oversee more than 10 planes was overwhelming him. This isn't surprising, given that he wasn't even certified to operate by himself without supervision. When he noticed the potential collision, he rushed to prevent a disaster. He quickly contacted the flight from Busan that was cruising at 37,000 feet and told them to dip lower, trying to create a bigger gap between the planes. In his rush, though, Hachitani had made a terrible mistake. He had contacted the wrong plane. Instead of telling the Boeing 747 to reduce its altitude, the pilot of the other plane followed Hachitani's instructions and lowered from 39,000 feet to 37,000 feet, the exact same height as the 747. Both planes sped toward each other at 500 miles per hour on a collision course. Hachitani was beginning to panic now. When he noticed that the flight from Busan hadn't descended, he quickly instructed it to turn right. The pilot had, of course, failed to follow the instructions given because they'd been sent to the wrong plane. For an unknown reason, the instruction to turn right failed to reach anyone at all this time. The communications from air traffic control were failing, and the pilots didn't have any idea of how much danger they were in. When seeing Hachitani panicking behind the control panel, his supervisor rushed to the scene and took control of the situation. She contacted the flight from Busan and now told it to climb up. Amazingly, when she did this, she gave the order to a flight that wasn't even operating that day. Both of the flights ignored her because they didn't know that the message was intended for them. The Boeing pilot was at least aware that there was another plane close by, but his faith in air traffic control would have comforted him. Surely, if anything was badly wrong, someone would send him more instructions? At this point, the crash was beginning to look inevitable. For the passengers on the flights, though, everything would have seemed to be normal. They might have been eating some snacks, stretching their legs, or maybe waiting in line for the toilet, completely unaware that they were on course to fly straight into another plane. Luckily for all of the 600-plus people involved, the pilot was well-trained and confident in a situation that would cause most people to freeze up. Through his windscreen, he saw something that no pilot should ever see: another plane heading directly for him. With cat-like reflexes and remarkable composure, the Boeing pilot gripped the throttle and steered the plane down as low as he could for the seconds he had before the collision. The Boeing flew straight underneath the other flight. Imagine being a pilot and seeing the ground in front of you instead of the sky. They both made it out intact. This man had saved the lives of more than 600 people. That isn't to say that everyone got out without a scratch. The passengers were completely unaware of the entire incident, so barely any were buckled in. They were powerless as the change in direction threw them against the inside of the plane. Out of nowhere, with the plane's sudden movement, many hit the roof with the force of a car crash. Every unsecured object and person were thrown through the air. Some might have even felt like the plane had just hit the ground. Miraculously, only 7 passengers and 2 crew members were seriously injured, and the rest only received minor injuries. The pilot circled back to Tokyo to allow all of the injuries to be treated. Thanks to the quick response of medical teams and unbelievable decision-making and skill shown by the pilot, everyone on the flight survived. Every time you travel on a plane, you're signing up to shoot through the sky at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour in a fragile metal shell. You're surrounded by enormous, dangerous motors, 6 or 7 miles above the ground. Surely there's no way you'd survive if the plane itself started to fail. The Hudson Bay landing shows that skilled pilots can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. On January 15, 2009, Flight 1549 was set to fly from New York to North Carolina. The pilot, Chesley Sullenberger, was a former jet pilot who converted to commercial flights in the 1980s. The sky was clear and the conditions were favorable. It was a typical flight for all of the 155 passengers on board, until the worst happened just a minute and a half in. As the plane climbed to 3,000 feet, they hit a flock of Canada geese. They hit the entire plane, but most importantly, some geese got caught in both engines. When Sullenberger realized that his engines were failing, he contacted air traffic control. They ordered him to land back at the airport, but he realized that it was impossible. With failing engines and no clear runway to land on, he had to take control of the situation to save the lives of everyone on board. Without full control of his plane, he wasn't able to operate at the normal altitude. He flew so low that he passed over the George Washington Bridge at only 900 feet. The people on the bridge were terrified to see the plane so close, but they had no idea how bad things were on board. With the plane speeding at 140 miles per hour, Sullenberger saw the Hudson River in front of him, and he had no choice but to land on it. Everyone in the control tower was shocked to hear what he had to do, but there was no other option. Landing on a runway is one thing, but commercial pilots aren't trained to land in a river. Sullenberger had to think clearly and plan the landing while flying towards the ground. He made sure to allow the tail to touch the water before the nose. Landing nose first would compromise the engines further and cause even more damage. Amazingly, the plane touched down on the water without falling apart. Their momentum gradually decreased until they were at a slow, steady pace across the surface. From a distance, people might have thought it was just a slow-moving boat. A ferry arrived impressively quickly to fetch the stranded passengers, who waited on the wings and the inflatable slides. Everyone received minor injuries from the collision with the river, but they all survived. Captain Sullenberger went down in history as one of the most remarkable pilots ever, having saved so many people from a seemingly hopeless situation There was even a movie made about his heroics.
No matter what happens, don't stop! We almost got it! Two treasure seekers are digging frozen ground in a cornfield at night. It's raining hard, lightning is flashing, but these two guys keep working. And now the shovel hits something solid. No way! A treasure chest! They start digging faster and find a piece of a ship's engine. What the? Far from the seas and lakes, somewhere under the fields of Kansas City, they found a giant sunken ship. How is this possible? Now you'll see. Some people spend their lives searching for shipwrecks with treasures underground. One of them is explorer David Hawley. He's been looking for such ships far from the seas, rivers, and oceans for many years. He does this because he likes the feeling of adventure. The holds of these ships may contain chests of gold, antiques, and artifacts. And you can get a lot of money for them. David says you don't have to go into the ocean to find a sunken ship. They may be lying in your backyard. But why do ships end up buried underground among fields, farms, and plains? Let's find out using the example of steamboat Great White Arabia. According to old records, the newspaper clippings, this ship had been carrying about 200 tons of treasure before it sank in 1856. Many rumors and local legends said the ship was lying underground, a few miles northeast of Kansas City. It was there because people deliberately altered the riverbed and channels of the Missouri River in the second half of the 19th century. They artificially brought the shores closer to each other. They narrowed the river to increase the flow's speed, so boats could sail much faster. In the 19th century, steamboats were the most popular means of transporting passengers and goods. Before railroads, they extended the western border across the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and brought supplies to people. That's why it was so important to increase the speed of their movement. So, on September 5, 1856, Arabia was sailing along such an estuary. It came across a snag sticking out of the water. A piece of log quickly flooded the ship. Fortunately, all passengers were evacuated. But the steamer and its precious cargo reached the silt bottom of the Missouri River in a few minutes. Several years had passed. Everyone forgot about the vessel. During this time, the course of the Missouri River had changed. But Arabia remained under the wet, muddy bottom. The soil level above it was getting higher, and the ground was losing moisture. Eventually, many decades later, a cornfield formed above the sunken ship. In the 1980s, one farmer owned this area, and he had no idea what was hidden in his territory. David Hawley carefully studied the history of the sunken ships of the USA. He knew that hundreds of steamers had gone underwater all over Missouri, but most of all, he was interested in Arabia, as there were rumors that it was filled with gold and other valuable things. The territory of cornfields in Kansas was vast, but David Hawley knew how to search properly. In 1987, he started working. First, together with his brother and father, they collected all the clippings from old newspapers they could find. They were looking not only for information about the steamer, but also for maps of the Missouri River. They tracked its historical changes, checked the dates, and identified a large area where the steamer sank. Next, they used electromagnetic testing and other geological stuff to study the soil and find the right place. They searched for differences in ground moisture and density. Then, they went through the territory with powerful metal detectors. And so, by the fall of 1988, they had determined the location of the steamer. Arabia was the size of a football field. This gigantic vessel lay 45 feet underground, 4 stories down. But before they started excavating, they had to ask the owner of the cornfield for permission. For the farmer, this news was a big surprise. He agreed, on the condition that the excavations would be completed by spring so that he could sow a new crop. Digging a giant ship in winter is much more difficult and expensive than at other times. It includes additional equipment, electricity, and heating costs. The team worked day and night. They financed the excavations out of their own pocket. Each invested more than $10,000 and took out a bank loan. Finally, they noticed the first details of the ship. The shovels hit the huge engine boilers and the deck. The goal had been achieved. Most of the cargo lying inside the sunken ships is covered with rust, shells, mud, and is badly damaged. The contents of Arabia were in excellent condition, considering that the ship had sunk 130 years prior. Unfortunately, they didn't find the chests of gold. Still, they got several tons of other valuable cargo, household items of people who lived in the middle of the 19th century. It was a time capsule. The ship was carrying supplies for hundreds and thousands of people, and all these things were perfectly preserved. For example, they could clearly see the brand stamp Goodyear Rubber Company on one rubber shoe. The longer the excavations continued, the more things David and his team found. In the barrels, they found plates from the 19th century. They were intact and usable. Also, there were clean clothes, thousands of pairs of shoes, harpoons, frying pans, and umbrellas. The ship was carrying cargo to supply about 16 small towns. Yes, it's not gold, but such artifacts are also precious. The contents of the ship could be worth millions. However, the crew wasn't going to sell these things. They made a museum on the site of a former fruit market in Kansas City. If you go there, you will immediately feel like you're in a department store of the 19th century. There are thousands of items in good condition. Even the matches here are dry enough to light up. It took David many years to present the entire collection from the steamship. He values each of the items and doesn't want to sell them. Anyone can come here, pay for a ticket, and find themselves in the past. Who knows, maybe there's an old ship hidden in your backyard too. Geologists found an older vessel in the hot desert of Namibia in 2008. This ship sailed back in the days when pirates scared sailors on the seas, and now it's inside a dried-up lagoon. The ship sailed from Lisbon in 1533 and disappeared with the crew near a small diamond mining town. After almost 500 years, the hull had been badly damaged. Only the carcass of the ship remained, but the treasure hidden inside the vessel stayed intact. They carefully studied the boat for a long time, trying not to ruin anything. And then, 5 days later, they found a big old chest in the hold. Carefully opening it, they found gold coins there. Thus, the cost of the ship was estimated at about $10 million. The exact cause of the shipwreck is unknown, but experts believe the ship was destroyed by heavy cargo and bad weather. It went to the bottom of a lagoon that later became a desert. Some find an airplane in their backyard, others discover a ship, and one man found a passage to an ancient secret city in his house. This happened in Turkey in 1963. The owners of the building decided to make repairs. He went to his basement and knocked down the wall to turn this place into a living room. And so, behind one wall, he found a tunnel leading underground. The man thought it was some kind of a secret chamber. He went down there and realized it was something much more than that. It was an ancient city 18 floors deep. People built it in the years 780 to 1180 as a refuge from weather disasters and the invasion of enemies. This place also includes many underground tunnels that stretch for several miles in different directions. People could get to the town from different points using secret passages leading to these roads. The city can accommodate about 20,000 residents, livestock, and tons of food supplies. Archaeologists have also found a chapel, schools, stables, and public kitchens there. They say nothing is ever lost, and it's true. Let's discover ships frozen in time. The first one is truly fascinating. Here, the Antikythera shipwreck. It's a Greek trading ship from the 1st century BCE. It's located on the east side of the Greek island of Antikythera and at the merging point of the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. Around 2,000 years later, in 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers discovered the wreck. They were going to Tunisia, yet they were forced to find shelter from a storm on a nearby island. Since they couldn't go anywhere due to the storm, they decided to look for sponges until the weather got calmer. One of the divers discovered the shipwreck at depths of around 130 feet. Imagine someone going for a sponge hunt, but getting out to the surface with archaeological treasures. The captain of the sponge boat talked to the Greek officials about what they had found. The officials sent 2 ships to the wreckage. The salvage operation was successful, and discoveries are now in Greece's National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The findings included 3 life-sized marble horses, jewelry, coins, and hundreds of works of art, including a 7-foot-tall Colossus statue of Hercules. Among these treasures, Antikythera ephebe, a bronze statue of a young man, caught more attention. Because the ephebe doesn't comply with any familiar iconographic model, and there are no known copies of his type, he held a spherical object in his hand. Scholars have different theories of who that person could be, but they are not in a consensus yet. More than 70 years later, Jacques-Yves Cousteau and his team went to the area and recovered hundreds more artifacts and the remains of 4 people. Interestingly, they discovered a complex set of interlocking gears, capable of predicting the movement of the sun, moon, and several planets. The mechanism can also show the times of solar and lunar eclipses years into the future. Think of this Antikythera mechanism as an early computer calendar, to plan significant events like agricultural activities, religious rituals, and Olympic Games. These artifacts found in the Antikythera wreckage are some of the most important findings in modern archaeology. Just the Antikythera mechanism itself has changed our perception of the limits of ancient technology. The mechanism has a sophisticated design and was made over 1,000 years ago. After all these amazing discoveries, experts believe that the wreckage site has remained largely unexplored, and is mostly because of its location and the landscape of the seafloor on which the ship rests. The wreck is too deep for scuba divers but too shallow to use something like a submersible. A survey made on the seafloor in 2012 showed evidence of a second wreck about 800 feet to the south. It's clear that this area has a lot to offer humanity. What would happen if those sponge hunters didn't go to the area? Scientists found a shipwreck in Antarctica at the bottom of the Weddell Sea 107 years after it sank. The name of the ship was Endurance, and it was the lost vessel of Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. Scientists who laid eyes on it decades later say it is among the greatest undiscovered shipwrecks ever. That is why they filmed the whole discovery. The video shows the remains of the Endurance and proves it is still in remarkable condition. It has been sitting in 10,000 feet of water for over a century, yet it looks like it sank very recently. So the story goes like this. The ship was crushed by ice and sank in 1915. Shackleton and his crewmates had to escape by themselves in small lifeboats. From then on, it was all about survival. Shackleton imagined to get his crew to safety. Then, the ship sank. Yes, this is a pretty impressive story. But why did scientists prize this ship? Firstly, Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition sailed to make the first land crossing of Antarctica. Yes, the crew was trapped in ice, but the intention was important. Secondly, it's about the challenge itself of finding the shipwreck. The Weddell Sea is almost always covered in thick sea ice. The same ice that made the Endurance sink. Getting near the presumed sinking location is super hard, let alone being able to conduct research. Experts of the modern expedition team foresaw the time when the lowest extent of Antarctic sea ice would come using satellite images. They realized that the weather was in their favor to start an expedition. Dr. John Shears said that they have successfully completed the world's most difficult shipwreck search, fighting against constantly shifting sea ice, blizzards, and temperatures decreasing to -0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeesh, I can't imagine the worst conditions in Antarctica if these conditions are in their favor. Lastly, look at this. It's timbers. They're very much intact. Plus, you can read the ship's name. It's still visible. Marine archaeologist Menson Bound says that this is the finest wooden shipwreck he has ever discovered. He has 50 years of career experience, so I believe the guy. So how come the wood is not rotten? Dr. Michelle Taylor, a deep-sea polar biologist, said that there has been little wood deterioration because the wood-munching animals are not in this forest-free region of Antarctica. Workers of a coal mine in East Serbia discovered 3 shipwrecks that had been there for at least 1,300 years. The largest shipwreck is an ancient Roman fleet. It's around 50 feet long with a flat bottom. It's estimated that the ship could carry a crew of 30 to 35 people. Looking at its hull, you can see the marks of repairs. Wow, this one had a lengthy career. It gives us insight into more than 1,000 years ago. The 2 smaller vessels, on the other hand, match descriptions of boats used by Slavic groups to attack the Roman frontier. These two have been discovered under mud and clay in an ancient riverbed. Apparently, in those times, there was a Roman base in a place called Viminacium City. Interestingly, Viminacium was a provincial capital with an estimated 40,000 inhabitants in the 4th century CE. For comparison, it was even larger than Pompeii. The Kostelach coal mine is a center of hidden gems. Archaeologists had found evidence of ancient human and animal activity here before. For instance, in 2012, experts found bones of at least 5 woolly mammoths, which went extinct about 10,000 years ago. Canadian archaeologists found a ship 150 years after it went missing in the Canadian Arctic waters. This merchant ship is called HMS Investigator. It was purchased in 1848 to search for the explorer Sir John Franklin's ship that got lost in the Northwest Passage expedition. So, HMS Investigator left Britain in 1850 for this rescue operation. The expedition crew, captained by Robert McClure, sailed the Investigator into the water. He realized that he was in the final leg of the Northwest Passage, the sea route across North America. But before he could sail into the Beaufort Sea, the 122-ton ship itself got stuck in the thick ice. The crew spent the winter over the Prince of Wales Strait. The following summer, McClure tried again to sail to the end of the passage, but the ice blocked his way once more. Here, too, the crew was forced to leave the ship. He steered the crew into the Bay of Mercy. There, they were to remain until 1853 when the crew of the HMS Resolute rescued them. Imagine a crew of 60 people who had to spend 3 winters in the Arctic without even knowing if they would survive. Later on, the ship was found sitting upright in about 36 feet of water. It was in very good condition. Arctic water has prevented the outer deck of the vessel from deteriorating quickly. The outline of the ship and its timber can be clearly seen. Plus, archaeologists have uncovered artifacts on land left by the sailors. They had unloaded everything before abandoning the Investigator. 3 sailor graves and 1 British naval shipwreck had also been discovered in the area. I wonder what else they could find there.
Wow, it's the only place where 1 minute you're learning 17 natural ways how to get rid of houseflies, and the next, you're taking an epic journey straight into a black hole. More than 10 billion, with a B, views in total. That's 47 billion minutes watched, or more than 70,000 years. That's all the way back to the Ice Age. No, I wasn't around then. 40,000 videos, hundreds of topics, and most importantly you, a whole 44 million of you. Our viewers. We could populate an entire country if we wanted to. We'd like to continue helping you learn and giving you useful skill improvement tips. Got a thirst for knowledge? We've prepared 4 masterclasses on creating a 2D character animation from scratch, 10 hours of video lessons, practical tasks using professional software, and additional materials that you can use with your own projects. Get the full course now and create your own animated masterpiece.
It has recently become a popular location for many tourists looking for the perfect place to get away from it all. If you're lucky enough to catch a sunny day here, it's like no other, I can assure you. Chances are, you'll end up having loads of foggy days, but let's be honest, they have a special allure of their own. This enchanting smile-shaped island is called Sable Island. It's located 190 miles from mainland Nova Scotia. It wasn't accessible to the general public until 2013. That's when it was added to the list of National Parks of Canada. You can get here either by plane or by water. But what's so enchanting about this place anyway? There must be something since the yearly tourist count is growing every year. Firstly, there's a spectacular number of wild horses here. There are between 200 and 500 horses roaming free all over the island. There's also a large population of gray seals. The place is also the only breeding location of a rare bird species called the Ipswich sparrow. If you're already considering a trip here, there are some things you need to know first. Remember that fog I mentioned earlier? Well, it turns out that Sable Island is the foggiest place in the Canadian Maritimes. I'm talking about approximately 127 foggy days each year. During such days, Sable Island literally disappears underneath a thick layer of fog. You won't be able to explore the place on your own either. The local regulations state that visitors need to travel within a group, and they also need to keep a 197-foot distance from the wildlife they can encounter here. As charming as this place may be, it holds a dark secret hidden beneath the sandy dunes, and it has nothing to do with beautiful creatures living here or the island's unique vegetation. Apart from being known from its horses and seals, Sable Island is infamous for an overwhelming number of shipwrecks. Over the years, about 350 ships have ended their lives here, on these sandbars. When survivors described their experiences, they usually mentioned harsh weather conditions near this mysterious island. The island also made its way into literature when it was described in a book called The Perfect Storm, which was written by Sebastian Junger and published in 1997. The book was so successful that it was later adapted for the big screen in 2000, with George Clooney playing the leading role. The first recorded shipwreck near Sable Island dates back to 1583. The boat was named the HMS Delight and was under the command of British adventurer and explorer Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Only 17 people managed to survive the catastrophe by escaping in a small boat. Records mention that they spent 7 days at sea before reaching the shores of Newfoundland. In 1884, another vessel named the Nicosia struggled in the thick fog as well. The ship was completely destroyed, but fortunately, all 18 crew members managed to survive. The captain's son was almost lost at sea when a lifeboat capsized when he was climbing into it. He somehow managed to stay underneath the lifeboat, which was completely submerged. When this lifeboat righted, he eventually emerged from the water and was rescued for the second time. The years between 1947 and 1999 were relatively quiet on the island. In 1999, though, a yacht called the Merrimack ran aground near the shore of the island at about 2 a.m. on July 27th. The 40-foot fiberglass boat had a crew of only 3 people. Natural gas exploration workers, who were luckily not far away, rescued them. The crew managed to fly safely to Halifax the next day. The owner of the Merrimack tried to recover his boat by hiring local fishermen. Unfortunately, this operation was unsuccessful, since only the fittings of the yacht were eventually saved. It took no more than 6 weeks for the sand and waves to crush and completely break up the hull of the Merrimack. So what is it about this place that's so dangerous for boats? Does it have anything to do with the weather? Or maybe there's other forces at play? The explanation turns out to be a bit more complex, and it wasn't easy to figure out, at least not way back in the 1500s. First of all, the island is located close to one of the world's richest fishing grounds. Since it's also near one of the major shipping routes between Europe and North America, hundreds of vessels sail past it each year. The likelihood of shipwreck increases when there are so many boats roaming around the area. Sable Island is also in the way of most of the storms that move up the Atlantic coast of North America. It's no surprise that boats often get hurtled straight onto the shores of this island. The weather has a lot to do with it too. During the summer season, the warm air from the Gulf Stream creates a dense fog as it merges with the cool air by the Labrador Current that passes by the island. Other currents don't help the matter. Sable Island is next to the meeting point of 3 major ocean currents: the Gulf Stream, the Labrador Current, and the Belle Isle Current. Since the 1950s, radars and other modern navigation tools have been used on commercial vessels as well. Up until then, the sextant was the main instrument used to figure out a ship's location. It doesn't mean that sextants weren't accurate, but this instrument couldn't work properly without a clear view of the sun or stars, which means it didn't help much in dense fog, such as the one surrounding Sable Island, or when it was cloudy. Often during bad weather, the captain of a ship navigated, relying on their experiences and intuition based on the ship's speed and direction. That's why most of the survivors in shipwrecks near Sable Island said that the captain had simply miscalculated the ship's position, crashing into Sable Island by accident. This dusty, sandy land is as unfriendly to ships as it is to trees. There's reportedly a single tree on the whole island, and it looks a lot more like a bush. It's actually a pine tree. And since the famous island horses don't see it as much of a food source, it somehow managed to survive. Reports say that the tree was planted back in the 1950s. local authorities were trying to grow a forest on the island to make it a bit more welcoming. They've planted tens of thousands of trees over the years, more than 69,000 evergreens, 600 fruit trees, and about 55 pounds of pine seeds, along with other plants which could survive the conditions on the island. But they were no match for the extreme weather and sandy soil. Out of all those plants, just one pine tree is still alive. Thanks to its resistance, it has even become a symbol of Sable Island. Interestingly, for around 40 years, the island also had just one inhabitant. Can you imagine that? One person living on a remote island for so many decades? It's the story of a woman called Zoe Lucas. She chose to surround herself with the only residents on the island: the horses, the gray seals, and the many species of birds. An esteemed naturalist, she mentioned in an interview she gave back in 2017 that she was used to living on the island and that she never got lonely. To survive here, she had to put together an essentials kit. It included a notebook to take notes and a pair of binoculars to study the wildlife. You can safely assume she wasn't scared of the intimidating surroundings, since she decided to eventually call this place home. At first, Zoe wanted to set up camp on one end of the island, near some abandoned buildings. But eventually, she settled in a wooden house near a bunch of sand dunes. A Canadian institution called the Meteorological Service of Canada put together the simple construction back in the 1940s. Parks Canada operates the building these days. Zoe's work included gathering as much data on the local horse population as possible. It could help scientists better understand how they managed to adapt to the unfriendly environment. She also helped gather the debris that made it to the shore to help track pollution levels. Among all the rubbish that she collected, there was a refrigerator and a crate full of fresh peppers. Some other specialists eventually started working rotating shifts on Sable Island to offer the brave woman a little bit of company now and then. At the beginning of the 20th century, somewhere off the coast of West Africa, a German steamship was leaving the port. Suddenly, the weather got worse, and the vessel entered a thick fog. The sailors ran aground on a sandbank close to the shore. Luckily, no one was hurt, and they were even able to save their precious cargo. But the ship was stuck in the sand for good. And it was not alone there. Nearly the entire length of the western coast of Namibia is called Skeleton Coast. If the name sounds scary, that's because it is. This 976-mile-long beach line is among the most dangerous places on Earth. The local Bushman tribes believe that their supreme deity made this land when it was angry. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to set foot in Namibia in the 15th century. And yep, they didn't like Skeleton Coast either. Portuguese explorers thought this land presented the gates to the underworld. This is the place where the Namib Desert meets the Atlantic Ocean. It might be dangerous, but it's actually beautiful. Plus, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If Skeleton Coast had a PR manager, they would quit on the first day on the job. The area is not exactly tourist-friendly because of its geography and history. Beneath the sand and the waves, there is a secret ocean currently lurking for unsuspecting sailors. It's called Benguela Current. It flows towards the north along the coast of southern Africa. This part of the Atlantic is rich in marine life, but the current's land neighbor isn't that happy with the deal. This arid climate created the Namib Desert, one of the driest regions on Earth. And that marine life I just mentioned? It's sharks. 11 species of them to be exact. And yes, the great white decides to pop by once in a while. So far, we've got a desert landscape, strong currents, and sharks. Not a place for a beachside resort, definitely. But if someone ends up on Skeleton Coast, will they know they're in danger? Don't worry, they will. The beach is littered with wrecks of all sizes and shapes. If you remember that German ship I mentioned in the very beginning, its massive and rusted stern is now sticking out from the desert sand. There are some 500 wrecks in total scattered along the coast, and it's a mixed crowd, from Portuguese galleons centuries old to ships that ran ashore here in the 21st century. A modern fishing ship called Zela India managed to slip from its tow rope in 2008 and ended up on Skeleton Coast. Okay, it didn't escape on its own. It had some help from the elements. But it's better to be a tourist attraction on a beach than to be broken up for scrap. That's where the trawler was originally going, poor thing. Skeleton Coast's most famous inhabitant, to call it such a place, is the wreck of the Dunedin Star. The British cargo liner ran aground here in 1942. The massive rescue operation that followed reveals why it's so dangerous for sailors to end up here. The rescuers managed to save all of the crew and passengers, but at a heavy price. An aircraft and a tugboat were lost in the process. It took the last of the rescuers a full 2 months to return home to Cape Town. Why, you might wonder? One look at the map of the region reveals the reason. It's an endless sea of yellow, which is the sand. There are so few roads here, so Skeleton Coast is hard to reach by land. There are also legal obstacles. You need a special permit to drive into the area. But the skeletons in the name of the area don't only refer to ships, they also stand for animal bones. Most of these belong to whales and seals. Many animals have adapted to the area, so lions and hyenas roam the coastline in search of a meal. Yeah, now there are hungry lions as well, as if those sharks weren't enough. Other animals with a temporary residence on Skeleton Coast include elephants, cheetahs, leopards, and giraffes. In 1971, the Namibian authorities established a national park here, but except for surfers, after an adrenaline rush, they don't get many visitors. You can understand why. The Namib Desert is the oldest desert in the world, and it's not very tourist-friendly either. Those who travel to the region should pack sunscreen and a warm winter jacket. A weird combo, right? Well, not so much when you think that during the day, temperatures soar over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, the air temperature drops below freezing. What a climate roller coaster! And that's not the final danger. Yep, there's more. Remember how that German ship got lost in thick fog? Yeah, it wasn't a one-off event. Because of the region's climate, fog shows up frequently. Sailors should cover their ears now, but this fog is actually good for wildlife. This is their only source of water in the Namib Desert. Reptiles and mammals have adapted to the harsh climate. They use as little water as possible. Shifting sands, thick fog, strong currents, lions, and sharks. Not the stuff you would put in a tourist booklet, but Skeleton Coast isn't the only beach on Earth you wouldn't want to spend your vacation on. I will take you to Cape Tribulation in Australia. The area covers some 48 square miles in the northwestern part of the continent. And no, the area is not as dry as Skeleton Coast. It's part of the Daintree rainforest. You could say that here, it is the rainforest, not the desert that meets the ocean. The beach at Cape Tribulation is straight from a postcard. But looks can be deceiving. Australia? Probably sharks. No, crocodiles are out here to get you if you decide to go for a dip in the sea. There are saltwater crocodiles that the locals call salties. Well, that's a cute nickname for such a dangerous reptile. And it's not just them. The wildlife seems to have a beef with visitors. From October to June, the waters around Cape Tribulation are full of box jellyfish. Their venom affects the human cardiovascular system. When touched by a jellyfish out at sea, swimmers won't have enough time to reach land for help. Vinegar helps neutralize the sting, so you might want to keep a spare bottle in your luggage. Crocodiles and jellyfish sound dangerous, but there's one more animal you should look after. It's the wild boar. It might sound funny, but you won't laugh when you're being chased by one of these across the beach. 21 million wild boars live in Australia. They're mostly active at night, making it even more dangerous if they charge at you. The best defense is running in circles. Wild boars can't cut corners well. That's probably why we don't see many of them taking up careers as race drivers. Cape Tribulation has one last danger installed for you, and it's not an animal. Out here, even the trees are plotting against visitors. The stinging tree got its name for a reason. If you try to pick one of its beautiful red berries, it'll fight back. Its prickles are like tiny glass shards. The less than pleasant effect on your skin will last for a month. Then there is this wait a while bush. Who keeps naming them like this? This long vine has spikes that grab hold and just don't let go. They are so strong, they can pull a human off a horse. You'll have to wait for someone to come by and save you from this thorny grabber. If you are about to cross this Australian beach from the vacation list, hold on for a second. Tourism is booming here. The local authorities have restricted access to all of the danger zones. Visitors go swimming in dreamy water holes that are surrounded by lush vegetation. There are even ropes to swing from. Now, that's a beach you can finally relax on.
They said it was the most technologically advanced ship. They said it was unsinkable. And when it sank, they made a movie about it. These were the main reasons why the Titanic disaster became world famous. But unfortunately, this is not the only large-scale shipwreck. And sadly, there have been cases much worse than the tragedy of the Titanic. One of them occurred on April 27, 1865. The Sultana steamboat carried passengers and cargo daily between St. Louis and New Orleans. It was a pretty large wooden boat with 3 decks and was 260 feet long and 70 feet wide, almost twice the size of a basketball court. The ship could carry about 350 passengers, but on that unfortunate day, more than 2,000 people were on it. On April 23rd, she was making a routine voyage from New Orleans when it broke down. Something was wrong with the boiler, so the vessel docked in Vicksburg for repairs. At the port, the ship's captain, James Cass Mason, found out about an excellent opportunity to earn a lot of money. All he needed to do was to transfer a large group of former prisoners to the north. The captain agreed to do it, but the problem was that the boiler required a lot of time to repair. Mason was afraid that his competitors would take the job, so he decided to sail despite the malfunction the ship had. He patched up the holes in the boiler instead of a big repair and invited all the ex-prisoners on board. So, there was a broken boiler, an excess number of passengers, a lack of lifeboats, and not the best river conditions. Also, the captain refused to send the ex-prisoners to the hold, so they were all with ordinary passengers. There were strong chances for a shipwreck, but the greedy desire to earn more money was stronger. The Sultana went on a voyage and sailed up the river for 2 days. At this time, one of the biggest Mississippi floods in history began. The river overflowed its shores because of the flood, with the water level rising several feet. All the trees on the shore disappeared, and only the tops were sticking out of the water. The ship sailed opposite this powerful current, making the boiler work too hard. On the evening of April 26th, the Sultana arrived in Memphis, Tennessee, and they loaded even more, 120 tons of sugar and 200 passengers. She got incredibly heavy. Around midnight, the ship continued its dangerous journey. The captain sailed to barges to load a shipment of coal. At 1 a.m., the vessel left the barge. At 2 a.m., the broken boiler, unable to withstand the load, suddenly exploded. The Sultana was just 7 miles north of Memphis. Few people survived that day. The problem was that passengers trying to escape from the fire jumped into a cold river with a strong current. The Sultana disaster is considered the most tragic shipwreck in the history of the United States. The exact number of those who didn't survive is still unknown. According to various sources, this number was from 961 to 1,800 people. Don't be surprised that almost no one knows this story. There were many more survivors in the Titanic tragedy, and everybody heard about it. But the Sultana sank during one high-profile event. 12 days before the shipwreck, the country lost Abraham Lincoln. People hadn't yet recovered from this news, so no one paid much attention to the tragedy of the Sultana. Many catastrophes happened quite recently by historical standards. One of them occurred in 2002. The ferry La Jula was a Senegalese vessel. The ferry sailed twice a week, mainly along the coast of Dakar, carrying passengers who traded mango and palm oil. It made daily voyages and never faced severe problems thanks to modern rescue equipment and good repair service. But one day, the ship's crew discovered a malfunction and sent the boat to port. For almost a year, La Jula was in a non-working condition, awaiting repairs. But it didn't get high-quality service. After poor maintenance, the ferry set off on its last voyage. On September 26, 2002, La Jula sailed between southern Senegal and Dakar, and at 11 p.m. headed toward Gambia, where a strong storm began. The wind raised high waves, but this wasn't critical for the large passenger ship unless the number of people on board didn't exceed the established norm. La Jula was supposed to carry about 500 passengers, but had many more people that day. Too many passengers, poor repairs, and a strong storm caused severe problems for the ship. But the main factor in the shipwreck was that La Jula was only built for sailing in coastal waters, but that day it sailed far from the shore. Big waves started rocking the boat, and at some point, it just turned upside down. The ship's deck went underwater, and its lower part stuck above the surface like an iceberg. All the passengers sitting in cabins fell on the ceiling and lost their orientation in space. There were no holes or damage in the ship's hull, and water flooded the lower decks for a long time. The vessel stood in a twisted position for several hours. Then, the boat began to sink when the water seeped through the deck and hold. The ocean was warm, but no one came to save the passengers. People had to wait almost 4 days to be rescued. Unfortunately, only a few managed to survive. The Philippines is a very dangerous area for ships. This place consists of several thousand islands and a vast area with shallow water. Ships can run aground and damage the hull with reefs and pitfalls. On September 20th, 1987, one of the most terrible disasters in navigation history occurred there. A Philippine passenger ferry called Dona Paz left one of the islands and sailed toward Manila. The sun was shining, the ocean was calm, and the visibility was good. But for some reason, the crew members didn't notice how the tanker Vector was approaching them. The two ships collided at low speed. The collision wasn't strong, but the problem was that the Vector had tons of oil on board, and the Dona Paz crashed into the cargo hold where that oil was stored. So it spilled all over the ocean, and then a spark slipped through. Not only did the two ships catch fire, but also filled with water. Both ships sank in a matter of seconds. Only a few dozen people survived that disaster. On September 27, 1854, the passenger ship Arctic sailed from Liverpool to New York. The fog came rolling down, and visibility got really bad. Another boat appeared out of the thick white haze, the French steamer Vesta. The ships were close enough to each other that a collision was inevitable. The French vessel was smaller, so it seemed to the Arctic's captain that Vesta had received a lot of damage. And while he was staring at the other ship, his boat got quickly filled with water. The captain gave the order to sail to the shore as fast as possible, but the ship's engines stopped working because of the flood. Then the ship's crew started to lower lifeboats with women and kids. Still, when rescuers found lifeboats with people, it turned out that only 87 out of 400 people survived, 65 crew members and 22 passengers. Surprisingly, there were only grown men among them. The ship's captain survived by clinging to the wreckage. All newspapers wrote about this story as one of the most terrible and shameful tragedies in navigation history. The survivors were criticized because they didn't save women and kids, and the crew members were accused of violating the law, since the safety of passengers should be higher than the safety of sailors. But despite this, none of them were brought to responsibility. Unfortunately, shipwrecks still occur to this day, but fortunately, there are fewer of them than before, thanks to modern navigation systems and radar. But no technology can guarantee there won't be a super strong storm or any other emergency that no one can foresee. The year was 1854, and the SS Arctic, the fastest passenger liner of its time, set out to cross the Atlantic. As it sailed through the misty veil, it slowly disappeared into the unknown. The Collins Line, an American shipping company, was started in 1818 and only began seriously trading in the transatlantic by 1835. Its steamships crossed the Atlantic from Liverpool to New York within just 10 days. Doesn't sound like a great speed today, I know, but back then, the same thing took other ships several weeks. Light on the water with their wooden hulls, powering through with a strong steam engine, those steamships were the favorite choice for many high-profile people. What could go wrong with such an advanced ship, they thought. This reminds me of some other ship everyone believed to be unsinkable. But anyway, back to the Collins Line. It grew to be a serious contender on transatlantic routes, with only one other competitor, the Cunard's Line. It was a British company also aiming to be the main force through the Arctic Passage. In 1835, the company received a new ship that traveled to Liverpool and came back to New York with the largest cargo ever at that time. From then, the Collins Line was steadily growing. It seemed like there would only be future successes for it. Unfortunately, their lavish ships became costly to run with the amount of coal used. Massive power along with weak wooden hulls meant they needed many repairs after each voyage. So, every trip ended up being expensive. But since the ships were safe and had a great reputation, people were willing to pay the price, and the company was definitely not in crisis. They had achieved something no one had managed to do before them. Like I told you, their ships crossed the Atlantic in a whopping 10 days, and Edward Collins, the owner, was very determined to maintain the pace. Their 5 ships easily outran the Cunard's Line of only 3. With this great praise, it provided more attention. Though the Cunard's ships were slower with their iron hulls, they believed there was still profit, regardless of how slowly they sailed. Among Collins' ships, the Arctic, the third of them to be launched, was the largest, reaching 284 feet long, with 2 side-lever steam engines, each with 1,000 horsepower. The paddle wheels made 16 revolutions a minute when at full speed. At the time of its launch, the press called it the most stupendous vessel ever constructed in the United States. But glamour and fame couldn't avoid what would come next. On the 27th of September, the Arctic was on its journey from Liverpool to New York, continuing a speed pace through the thick fog. It's possible that by that moment, after 4 years of record-breaking trips, the crew became overconfident with their sailing and the ship. Going only 50 miles from Newfoundland, they carelessly continued through the fog with no radio contact, sonar, or any other form of identifying objects, equipped only with Morse code. A smaller ship, the SS Vesta, which operated as a fishing vessel, often worked around Newfoundland. It was passing through the same path as the Arctic and crashed into its side. Shocked by the collision, the captain of the Arctic offered help to the much smaller Vesta, but it was soon clear that the damage that seemed minor on the Arctic was far worse. Beneath the waterline, a hole was letting water into the hull. The cost of the much faster wooden hull now seemed less valuable. They steered toward land, trying to plug the holes, but they weren't doing so well, and the seawater continued to pour in, filling up higher and pushing the ship down. And finally, once the engine room was full, it put out the boilers, taking away the massive power the Arctic was once legendary for. They moved slowly until coming to a complete stop. The ship continued to sink, and the order was to abandon it. At the time, maritime law allowed for the Arctic to carry only 6 lifeboats, only capable of saving 180 people. The crew and some of the passengers managed to push their way aboard and took most of the seats on those boats. Things were pretty wild, and everyone forgot about their manners, not letting the ladies and the youngest ones board first. It took 4 hours for the Arctic to sink. 150 crew and 250 passengers were on board. Those that weren't able to find a lifeboat made a desperate attempt to build their own rafts from parts of the ship. 2 days later, only 3 boats made it safely to the shore. The other 3 were never found. Believe it or not, The rescue party also saved some people that had been clinging to the wreckage for 2 days. Unlike the crew, the captain went down with the Arctic, but amazingly survived. He would be only one of 85 people that made it, out of the 400 on board. When the news arrived 2 weeks later, the public responded with great sadness to the losses. Great anger soon followed towards the poor safety measures in the crew. The press published demands to change the laws for more lifeboats. It only made sense to have enough for every person on board a ship. But they ignored those requests. This neglect would lead to more disasters in the future. Enough lifeboats would only come into maritime law some 60 years later, after the disaster of the Titanic. Edward Collins' wife and 2 children were also aboard the ship and didn't return. He was heartbroken, but didn't stop running his business. The Collins line still had a reputation to uphold, the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious on the Atlantic. Edward Collins would now build an even better ship than any other. It was named the Adriatic, and it was the largest ship in the world, 354 feet long. With 2 alternating steam engines that had never been built of this size. These steam engines at the time were at the height of engineering, though today you can only see them in models and toys. With the new addition of 2 masts, the Adriatic would also be able to sail if needed. Luckily, they made some lessons from the disaster of the Arctic. But before their new ship, the Adriatic, was built, another disaster had occurred. The sister ship of the Arctic had also sunk. They believed this second ship was desperate to stay in front of the Cunard's line and hit an iceberg somewhere during the race. This weird contest took the lives of 141 people. The desperation of Collins and his weakly built hulls pushed the company towards bankruptcy in 1858. The newly built Adriatic, costing over $1 million, had only made 1 voyage in the end. And even that voyage was considered a disaster. The ship collided with a tugboat. It still managed to finish its maiden voyage at a suitable time. After the company had gone bankrupt, they had to sell the ship for only $50,000. They removed the great giant engines, replacing them with only sails. Although it was once the greatest ship on the high seas, it was only 30 years later until it was abandoned, labeled irreparable, and anchored in a river. The other remaining ships were also sold and only used for parts. Edward Collins left the industry altogether, seeking work on dry land instead. As the Collins line was no longer in the mix, the Cunards would grow in strength. Without competition, they would win the Blue Riband for the next 30 years, and 180 years later, after producing hundreds of ships. They still have a constant presence on the seas, as they provide transatlantic crossings, world voyages, and leisure cruises. To this day, the Cunard line is the only one to run ships between Europe and America, and it's great proof that it's not always the fastest that's the best. It's 2018. You get up early in the morning to go ashore and catch some fish. You come to the spot you were yesterday, throw the hook into the sea, and wait. The float is twitching. You've caught some fish, but hey, hello? Why aren't you doing anything? Right now, you don't care about the fish. You're looking at something in the distance. You open your mouth in surprise, since you see a huge ship stuck on a shoal. It wasn't here yesterday, so it got here at night. Okay, it'll probably sail away sooner or later. You fish for a few more hours. During this time, you observe the ship and notice no movement there. Is it empty? Boats and the Coastal Service are sailing from the shore to the vessel. You decide to check it out too. You get in your old boat and go there. The mist descends to the water, making the ship look creepy. The colossal vessel is rusty and empty. But where is the whole crew? And how did it get there? The Coast Guard comes on board. They search the hold, the cabins, and the upper deck. There's someone's stuff, some remnants of food supplies, notebooks, and clothes. Everything suggests the crew has disappeared for some reason. Fishers who noticed the vessel first didn't see anyone coming down from the board. No radio signals were sent to the port, and no one reported about the ship. It appeared here from nowhere. The only chance to get any information is to look at the number and name of the vessel. This is Sam Ratulangi, PB 1600. The Coast Guard checks the information, studies the data of all the country ships, and no way. One company built the boat in 2001 in Indonesia. People used it to transport heavy loads across the seas around Asia. The ship had been properly operating for 8 years. People were delivering industrial goods to different points in the region, but something went wrong. In 2009, Sam Ratulangi was sailing near the coast of Taiwan, and that's it. There were no further records about it. There were no reports in any port. Everyone thought it must have drowned, so no one had been looking for it for years. And then, 9 years later, it appears here, big and rusty, off the coast of Myanmar, without sailors, without fuel. An investigation starts. City services are trying to find out the names of all the sailors working on the ship and find clues that would lead to solving this mystery. They also hope the ship owner will appear soon. They find 2 tow ropes on board. This means that some other ship towed Sam Ratulangi to this place. Then they identify and find 13 crew members. These people say they wanted to reach the factory in Bangladesh to repair Sam Ratulangi. Another vessel helped tow the ship, but then 2 cables tore off, and a storm began. No one wanted to stay on board during such weather, so the crew members left it. No one knows what the ship has been doing for the last 9 years, and how it was possible without people on board. And here's another, much more mysterious ship story. On February 16, 2020, locals found a large cargo ship stuck on a rocky shore off the coast of an Irish village. The boat looked rusty, with holes in the hull and rotten parts. People hadn't seen this vessel the day before, so it appeared there at night. The last time people saw the Alta cargo ship was a few months earlier, thousands of miles off the coast of Ireland. That day, the Alta was sailing in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Another ship, the MS Protector, noticed it. MS Protector crew members tried to contact the ship, but received no response. The people on board realized that they were facing an empty vessel. And then, 5 months later, it appeared near the coast of Ireland. There are more questions than answers in this story, but we managed to find something out. In 2015, the Alta appeared and disappeared from the radar several times. Any ship has an internal tracking system, so people can track its route using satellites. But Alta crew members often disabled this system. Perhaps they were engaged in some illegal activity. Anyway, in 2017, the ship often sailed between the ports of Greek islands. Then, the tracking signal disappeared and appeared only 10 months later, off the coast of North Africa. During this time, the ship changed several flags. In September 2018, the Alta was southeast of Bermuda and headed for Haiti. Then, the crew started facing problems. First, the main engine failed right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The ship began to drift. Several days passed, but the crew members weren't able to repair it. They began to run out of food and water supplies. The situation got even worse when they found out that a hurricane was approaching the place. Fortunately, they managed to contact the U.S. Coast Guard. A helicopter flew to the Alta on October 2nd to bring them some supplies. There was enough food for several days. Then, a rescue boat sailed to the ship. It evacuated all the sailors and delivered them to Puerto Rico before the hurricane. The Alta had to drift alone in the ocean. After a while, another ship approached the Alta to tow it to the shores of Guyana. But at this moment, everything went wrong. Someone stole the boat, disabled the tracking system, and sailed away in an unknown direction. After almost a year, the MS Protector found the empty Alta in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And then, 9 months later, the ship without a crew sailed to the shores of Ireland. how did it manage to travel across the Atlantic and get to the coast of Ireland? It's still a mystery. Maybe it was just luck. No one else saw the ship all this time. It was just covering huge distances, surviving storms. Who's the captain? What happened to the thieves? Who owns the ship now? One day, someone called the village administration and introduced themselves as the vessel owner. But that unknown person didn't provide any evidence. They found several barrels of oil on the ship, which they took away by helicopter. The Alta was rusting. Corrosion of metal could damage the environment. The vessel had no commercial value, yet it would have taken millions to get rid of it. There were 3 options for what to do: leave the ship where it was, tow it into the sea and let it sink, or disassemble it for scrap. But nature had its own plans. Storms and strong waves split the hull into 2 parts. The Alta was drifting without a crew in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean for about 2 years. But this is nothing compared to a ship that was traveling for 38 years. The record belongs to the SS Bechimo. It was a merchant vessel owned by some trading company. In 1931, the ship found itself on the ice off the coast of Alaska. Its movement slowed down. A thick layer of ice blocked the ship, and a strong storm only made the situation worse. The blizzard was so intense that the crew members couldn't see anything but a white veil in front of their eyes. Sailing any further was impossible. The team had to wait for the storm to end. They waited for a day, 2, 3 days. A week had passed, but the snowstorm was only getting stronger. Then, one day, it grew weaker. The crew members split into 2 teams. The first team went to the nearest city. The second group, along with the captain, stayed on board. They set up camp next to the ship and waited for the blizzard, which had started again, to end. There was 0 visibility. And finally, one day, the storm was over. Great! And now, wait a minute. But where is the ship? The SS Bechimo just disappeared during the blizzard. The captain was sure that the ship had sunk, so he left along with the crew. Then, a week later, they saw the vessel drifting near the area where they had lost it. The hull was damaged so severely that it was unsafe to sail on it. Repairing the ship would be pointless and expensive, so the captain decided to abandon it. He was sure that it would go underwater sooner or later, but it stayed afloat for the next few days, the next few months, and a few years. People had reported seeing it at various points along the coast of Alaska for 38 years. The last record of the SS Bechimo is dated 1969. Those who saw it claimed the ship was completely frozen, almost merged with the ice. Some people planned to start an expedition to find the ship, but all attempts were unsuccessful. The vessel is probably lying somewhere on the deep sea floor.
Thick fog is rising over the ocean as the sun is slowly sinking towards the horizon. It's hard to see further away than a few dozen feet, but that's enough to notice a hulking, skeletal shape in the distance. As your ship approaches the figure, your heart beats faster, and then you make out the details of another vessel, abandoned by the looks of it. Ghost ships do exist, and their mysteries aren't always solved. Take MV Hoita, for example. It was a wooden vessel built in 1931 as a luxury yacht. It had served well to various people over 20 years before it was bought by a Samoan sailor and became a merchant ship. In 1955, though, Hoita's service came to an abrupt and mysterious end. On October 3rd, it set sail for another trading voyage that should have taken no more than 48 hours. Delays happen in the sea, so when Hoita didn't arrive on October 5th as scheduled, there was little worry yet. But then it failed to come on the following day too. There was no distress signal or any other sign of Hoita's presence anywhere between its departure and arrival points. A search and rescue party was dispatched to find the ship, and for 6 days, they were scouting the area of nearly 100,000 square miles. On October 12th, the mission returned to the base empty-handed. Hoita vanished without a trace. It was only a month later that another merchant ship, Tuvalu, noticed the missing vessel far away from its route, drifting in the open sea and listing heavily. The sailors boarded the ship and found that all of its crew and passengers, 25 people total, were missing, along with all the cargo the vessel had been carrying. The radio was tuned to the International Distress Channel, meaning that the crew had been trying to ask for help, but they couldn't reach anyone because the radio cable had been damaged, limiting the range to 2 miles. The lifeboats were missing as well, indicating that people on board must have left the ship. Unfortunately, they seem to have taken the logbook with them, leaving the rescue team clueless as to what had happened. Even today, the mystery of MV Hoita hasn't been solved yet. No one knows where the crew and passengers had gone and what had caused them to leave. SV Carol A. Deering wasn't a ghost ship in the usual sense of the word. There are no sightings of it in the open sea. Instead, it was found on the shore, but the circumstances of it running aground are a puzzle shrouded in mystery. Carol A. Deering was built in 1919 in Maine, and it was a large vessel made for commercial voyages. Unfortunately, despite its large cost of construction, it had only served for a year before its last trip. July 19, 1920. The ship was traveling from Puerto Rico to Rio de Janeiro via Newport News to deliver a cargo of coal. It was almost halfway to the final destination when the captain fell seriously ill, and the crew turned back to drop him and his son off and replace the captain. The voyage went without incident, but when it came to Barbados in December to resupply, there were strange moods among the crew. The first mate didn't seem to be happy with the new captain. No one paid much attention to it back then, when they probably should have. The last sighting of Carol A. Deering at sea was on January 28, 1921, when a lightship noticed it off the coast of North Carolina. There was some commotion on the quarterdeck of the ship, where the crew were normally not allowed. Then, another vessel sighted it, but there was already no one on the decks. On January 31st, the merchant ship was found hard aground in the Diamond Shoals, a site notorious for numerous shipwrecks that had been occupying there for centuries. When the search and rescue party boarded the ship, they found it abandoned, the log and personal belongings of the crew gone, along with the 2 lifeboats. There is still no answer to what happened on board of Carol A. Deering that January, although the most popular version was mutiny. Maybe we'll never find out the truth though. SS Bechimo is perhaps one of the most notable ghost ships in history. This large cargo steamer was built in 1914 in Sweden and plodded its way dutifully over 16 years, trading provisions for pelts with native tribes of Alaska and Canada. But then, on October 1st, 1931, Bechimo got caught in pack ice. At first, it seemed the crew would be able to wait it out and continue on their route because the ship broke free in a couple of days. But in less than a week, it became caught again, this time for good. In another week, a rescue party was sent to fetch 22 of the Bechimo's crew, while another 15 remained behind to wait through the winter if necessary and get the ship back. But a month later, after a powerful blizzard struck their camp, the sailors went out of their shelters only to find the ship gone. Luckily, a few days later, a native hunter told them Bechimo hadn't been lost yet. He'd seen it about 45 miles from where they had been stationed. They managed to track it down, but decided the ship wouldn't survive the winter. So they took the most valuable cargo from its hold and abandoned it. They were wrong though. SS Bechimo did survive that winter, and many more that followed. When the ice broke, it sailed away on its own, drifting listlessly along the shores of Canada and Alaska. There were numerous sightings of the ghost ship, sometimes adrift in the open sea, and at other times stuck in the pack ice again. People attempted to board and salvage it, but weather conditions or lack of equipment always prevented them. SS Bechimo was last sighted by native Alaskans in 1969, 38 years after its abandonment. What became of it later remains unknown. The story of SS Orang Medan is one of the most puzzling and harrowing ghost ship stories of the 20th century. No one even knows for sure if the ship even existed in the first place. It wasn't recorded in Lloyd's Shipping, the International Register of Ships, which makes it either a tall tale or a vessel that avoided being officially recognized for some shady reasons. In any case, the accounts as to what happened to the Medan vary. According to most reports, it was carrying some unknown cargo in the Indonesian waters when a distress call was received by another ship in the vicinity. The officer on duty heard an SOS message, but its contents are different depending on the accounts. The message did not repeat, and the crew of Medan didn't answer to any attempts to contact it back. The ship that received the distress call hurried to the rescue, but they only reached the vessel the following day, when it was already drifting and slightly listing. When the rescuers boarded the ship, they found that none of the crew had survived. However, one lifeboat was missing, which implied that there was at least one crew member who managed to escape. What happened to the rest of the people on board remains a mystery to this day. Still, there are no hard facts about this story, so we might never find out whether SS Orang Medan was actually a ship and not a thing of fiction. SV Zabrina was a 3-mast sailing barge built in 1873 for river trade ships in South America. She served for well over 4 decades, proving to be a sturdy and reliable ship. It was later transferred to Europe, where it continued serving its purpose well. But then, in October 1917, Zabrina set sail on a regular voyage only to be found ashore several days later. Mysteriously, although the ship was perfectly intact, the entire crew of 5 and the captain were gone. There is no direct evidence or hard facts as to what really happened that day. The most convincing theory is that the crew were washed away from the deck because of an underwater explosion. And then the ship sailed ahead without them. But the truth, as always, remains unknown.
April 14th, 1912. The Titanic crashed into a huge iceberg and sank. Yep, we've covered that. But what if this time we use the ice to bring the ship to the surface? This requires several thousand feet of wire mesh and a lot of liquid nitrogen. Our goal is to put the Titanic in a huge block of ice that will raise the ship to the surface. Now to do this, you need to wrap the wreck in a wire mesh and cover it with liquid nitrogen. The first problem you face is the inability to wrap the ship completely. You need to somehow lift the ship a little to put the mesh under it. Let's say that by some miracle you manage to do so. Next, you need to transport hundreds of large tanks of liquid nitrogen. You're underwater, opening the tanks, and it's so cold that the icy water of the Atlantic Ocean looks like it's boiling. The nitrogen just sizzles, dissipates, and certainly doesn't create a block of ice around the mesh. Alright, new attempt. Raise the Titanic with the help of huge magnets. For this, you need a large cruiser and some powerful magnets. You attach thick cables to the magnets and lower them to the bottom. Bright projectors illuminate the black ocean depths. Parts of the wreck are visible. The magnets descend lower and cling to the iron hull of the ship. The cruiser pulls the cables and magnets up. Some of them detach from the Titanic as the iron surface is covered with reefs and corals. Some parts of the wreck break away from the ship and rise. The power of the cruiser is not enough. One of the cables is torn. Not only the weight of the individual parts of the Titanic, but also the colossal water pressure interferes with the operation. The sunken ship can't be raised completely, only its small parts. In reality, there has already been an attempt to raise the Titanic in parts. The $5 million operation failed. Nylon slings were attached to a large part of the wreck. The other ends of the slings were connected to the diesel engines. For the entire operation, they used a mini submarine. A piece of the Titanic weighing 21 tons was pulled up, but one of the slings broke because of the strong water pressure. Then, one by one, the other cables began to snap, and a huge piece fell back to the seafloor. By this time, all the participants of the rescue operation had run out of food supplies, and it was far from the nearest shore, so they decided not to make a second attempt. A book was written and a movie was made about how the Titanic was lifted with compressed air. In reality, no one even attempted this operation. To do this, you'd need several hundred large cylinders of compressed air. At first, you install them inside the Titanic's hull and wait for them to pull the ship to the surface. As soon as you lower the cylinders under the water, they immediately float upwards. This greatly complicates the operation. You need to fasten the cylinders with cables and pull them down to the bottom using a powerful submarine, or better yet, several of them. Because of the high pressure, the cylinders might burst. In this case, the blast wave would hit other cylinders and provoke a catastrophe. Too expensive and unsafe. The most expensive and complex plan to raise the Titanic is probably the one where scientists somehow extract hydrogen and oxygen from the ocean water. Then, these extracted elements must fill special containers. Those containers are attached to the ship, and the Titanic would rise to the surface. Even if you extract oxygen and hydrogen from millions of tons of water, the rest of the ocean water will replace it. A machine that will be capable of such filtering should cost billions of dollars. Or you can come up with a chemical element that will use a chain reaction to purify all the water. In this case, the entire world ocean will be left without vital oxygen. Someone once suggested blowing up the Titanic. You'd need to lower several boxes of dynamite to the ocean floor. The boxes must be completely sealed to prevent the dynamite from getting wet. Next, you need to run several miles of wire conducting an electrical current to them. Once all this is done, you sail to a safe distance. Now, you're going to press the button to pass the current through the wire and activate the dynamite. 3, 2, 1, stop! Why would you do this? Even if it works, the wreckage of the Titanic will be scattered in all directions on the seabed. It will be impossible to lift the Titanic from the ocean. Imagine a huge hook that can fetch the Titanic and lift it from the bottom like a fish. This hook must be huge to pick up a sunken ship. Let's say you created it. Next, you're on a huge cruiser, sailing up to the crash site and lowering the hook down like an anchor. It falls right on the Titanic but doesn't cling to it. You need special equipment to attach a bus-sized hook to the Titanic. It would include a huge submarine with mechanical arms. To build such a device and make it work under enormous pressure is already next to impossible. But let's say you finally managed to hook the Titanic. It's then you realize the cruiser doesn't have enough power to lift the ship weighing more than 50 tons and the hook that adds about 10 tons more. To complete your task, you'll need a few more cruisers and a few extra $1 million. Once hot wax cools, it hardens and floats on the water surface. What if we deliver it to the ocean floor and pour it inside the Titanic? This may work, given that wax is not an expensive material. So you melt the wax, pour it into strong tanks, and pull them to the bottom with the help of a submarine. The tanks can withstand enormous pressure, and the submarine has enough power to lower the wax to such a depth. The containers are placed inside the Titanic. Through a remote control, you open the containers, but the wax doesn't pour out. The deeper you go, the colder the water gets. While you were delivering the containers to the ship, the wax was cooling down and getting solid inside. Several containers are pressed against the top of the ship, but it's not enough to lift the Titanic. Other containers simply float away to the surface. And even if the containers were thermostatic and kept hot inside all the time, once released, the wax would solidify in an instant. There would just be no time for it to spread and cover the Titanic from within, so it would just float up as well. Alright, you fill several large and sturdy bags with Vaseline. This substance acts just like wax in the cold. It gets solid and floats. You want to put bags all over the Titanic and just wait for the Vaseline to bring it up. You load the bags into the submarine and descend to the ocean floor. Some parts of the ship can't be reached because of the clinging corals. You decide to unload all the bags in one place, but as soon as you take Vaseline out of the submarine, the bags tear due to the strong pressure. Solid pieces of Vaseline float up, pushed by the water. Mission failed. The craziest idea is to fill the Titanic with millions of ping pong balls. Small plastic balls filled with air should push the ship to the surface. But as soon as you start to lower them to the bottom, the plastic immediately flattens and all the air from the balls pops out. You can deliver the balls inside a submarine, but once you put them inside the Titanic, the pressure will crush them again. Also, you can create balls made from strong ultralight material and fill them with air. In this case, you will need much more money. As soon as you put the balls inside the ship, some of them will immediately slip through the holes in the ship, and the remaining ones won't be enough to lift the wreck weighing more than 50 tons from the bottom. Well, to study the Titanic, you don't need to go down to the ocean floor. On the internet, you can find a detailed 3D map that shows the wreck site, as well as the ship itself on the seabed. To get a realistic picture of the Titanic, researchers used sonar technologies and underwater robots, which took more than 10,000 pictures of the sunken ship. So, what do you think? Leave it alone? Yeah, me too.
We've heard stories about people surviving in the desert, Amazon forest, and uninhabited islands for weeks. Such stories show how tough and resilient people can be. But among these many cases, there is one that can really amaze you. It's the story about a guy who spent 3 days inside a sunken ship at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. He didn't have oxygen tanks, electricity, communications, or food, but he survived. So, it all happened in 2013 on a tugboat that was moving through the Atlantic waters along the coast of Nigeria. That day, early in the morning, there was a small storm. The tug was pulling a vessel with oil tanks. Then, all of a sudden, a huge wave formed. It crashed into the ship and broke the cable. At 4:30 a.m., the tugboat turned upside down. Its entire deck was underwater, and the ship's hull stuck out from the surface. The boat began to sink slowly. The crew of 12 people were trapped, as they all were in their locked rooms. They had closed the doors in their cabins as a precaution, since there were many pirates in those waters. Because of the locked rooms, they couldn't get out. But one of them, cook Harrison Okina, was in the bathroom during this time. The bathroom turned over. Harrison fell on the ceiling. All the clothes and toilet shelves fell on his head. He was stunned and didn't understand what was happening. When he heard the screams of the other crew members, he realized that the ship was sinking. Harrison struggled to his feet. Holding on to the walls, he slowly went out of the cabin. The water level rose above his head. Harrison took a deep breath. He intuitively, driven by fear, reached the engineering room. There was a small pocket with air. This space wasn't wholly flooded, since the water didn't get there, and the air hadn't come out. Harrison realized that this was the safest place for him at that moment. He had no fresh water and no food. He was in a cold, damp room. The floor was flooded, and Harrison's feet began to freeze. There was almost no chance of survival. The man found a soda bottle inside the room and a life jacket with 2 flashlights attached to it. By this time, the ship had descended to the bottom of the ocean at a depth of 100 feet. This is about the height of a 10-story building. The ship's hull was squeezed and made a grinding noise due to the pressure of the water. Then, Harrison heard a strange movement outside the door. It was sharks and other fish that were investigating the deck. At this point, Harrison began to lose hope. Lack of food supplies and pressure weren't the main problems. The air pocket was small, which meant there was little oxygen. Every 24 hours, an average person consumes about 350 cubic feet of air, which means Harrison had less than 1 day left to breathe. But despite this, he lived in such conditions for about 60 hours. This happened thanks to the water. The pressure around the ship was so intense that it compressed the air by about 4 times. Another problem was the cook's breathing. When we inhale, we absorb oxygen. When we exhale, we release carbon dioxide. This substance is dangerous to your health if its concentration in the air is 5%. Harrison slowly filled the room with carbon dioxide, and he couldn't get out. With each hour, it became harder to breathe. But here again, he was lucky. Water absorbs carbon dioxide, and Harrison moved and splashed it in different directions. Thus, unknowingly, he increased the water area and kept the carbon dioxide level below critical. But even here, his dangers were not over. Hypothermia may occur in a dark, cold room. It's a condition when your body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You get cold, and your perception of the world gets distorted. You don't understand where you are and what's going on. You may lose your memory and even experience terminal burrowing. This weird behavior occurs during hypothermia when a person tries to find a small shelter, even if they're in a closed room. They can even start digging the cold floor with their bare hands. At the same time, a person quickly freezes and loses consciousness within 2 hours. Harrison's room was filled from below with icy water. He wouldn't have survived in such conditions if he had stayed on the floor for several hours. But he managed to build a small platform with a mattress. This kept him slightly above the water level. With each passing hour, fear and despair more and more bound the survivor's mind. He couldn't get out for many reasons. One of them was that only a little sunlight passes to such a depth, and Harrison couldn't see it. The soda bottle was almost empty, and the flashlight stopped working. The man found himself in pitch darkness, but his salvation was close. While rescuers were searching for survivors nearby, he was thinking about his family and life. Harrison noticed rays of light through a hole in the wreckage. Divers were examining the seabed. It was the only chance to survive. Harrison came out of the air pocket and swam towards the rescuers. He was making his way through the darkness. The ray of light coming from the diver's flashlight disappeared. Harrison tried blindly to find the diver, but they were at the other end of the deck. His oxygen was running out, so Harrison decided to return. There was almost no air left in his lungs. He began to suffocate, but still got to the rescue room. The main thing was not to despair. It was his only chance for salvation. After catching his breath and replenishing the oxygen supply in his lungs, Harrison made a second attempt. He got out of the room and noticed the diver. He swam towards them with all of his might. The lifeguard didn't see Harrison, so the cook knocked on his neck from behind and grabbed his hand tightly. The diver was initially scared, but he realized a living person was in front of him. Harrison swam to his room and led the lifeguard as his oxygen ran out. You can easily find a recording from the diver's camera on the internet, where the frightened Harrison was in his rescue room during a meeting with the diver. The rescuers gave him an oxygen mask. They didn't believe there was a living person in front of them. Harrison couldn't immediately get to the surface because of the pressure. He spent about 60 hours on the seabed, so he needed to change the pressure levels slowly to prevent damage to his health. Therefore, the divers put him in a decompression chamber to gradually reduce the external pressure. Then, when Harrison got out, he saw the stars. The cook thought that he had been at the bottom of the ocean all day, so he was surprised when he found out that he had been underwater for 60 hours. Also, he thought that all the crew members had forgotten about him and left the ship at the beginning. Many years have passed since then, but Harrison still has nightmares about his air room. Sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night and tells his wife that the bed is sinking and they're now at sea. A similar case occurred in 1991 with scuba diver Michael Proudfoot. He was studying a sunken submarine off the coast of Baja California. During this dive, he accidentally broke his breathing regulator and deprived himself of oxygen reserves. Michael couldn't get to the surface because he was too deep. He wouldn't have had enough air in his lungs. Fortunately, the diver found an air pocket inside the ship. He swam there and waited for rescuers. For 2 days, he was underwater in complete darkness. He ate raw sea urchins and drank a small amount of warm water from a found pot. Fortunately, rescuers found him. Michael Proudfoot got out of the trap and stayed alive. The moon shines brightly and illuminates the black water of the ocean. Thick fog descends on it in ominous silence. Then, it's suddenly broken by the creaking of wooden boards, followed by a rippling of the waves. Through the fog, you see the outline of an old, large ship. Its hull is rusty, and a strange cold is coming from it. But the most unsettling thing is that there's no one on the deck. The ship sails without a crew. No, this isn't a mythical Flying Dutchman, but a very real ghost ship. September 2nd, 2019. The British Royal Navy's ice patrol ship, called the HMS Protector, sails through the calm waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The time is 11 p.m. Some of the ship's crew are on deck, while others are sleeping in their cabins. The captain steers the ship and looks straight at the horizon. The sky is lit up by an orange twilight, and clouds float in the distance. Suddenly, against this beautiful landscape, one of the sailors notices the black silhouette of an unknown ship. The captain slows down and steers the ship a little closer to the mysterious vessel. This is an old cargo ship, 250 feet long. Attempts to contact the crew members lead to nothing. It seems the unknown boat is floating in the ocean by itself. There's no one on board, at least no one alive. The deck of the ship creaks from rocking on the waves. The sun sinks below the horizon and it gets dark. The ship looks terrifying. British sailors don't dare to climb on that strange deck. They take a photo, post it on the internet, and sail away. Many people on the internet will assume the sailors met a real ghost ship. 5 months later, we're in the village of Ballycotton in County Cork, Ireland. A local leaves the house early in the morning to go for a daily run. Music in his headphones, fresh cool air, and a scenic route are ideal conditions for a good workout. The jogger runs along the road on the coast of the Celtic Sea. There was a strong storm last night, and now the sea looks calm. The man runs along the top of a low cliff and notices a huge vessel. An old rusty cargo ship 250 feet long lies on the beach, right among the rocks. No people on board. It seems the ship has been here for ages, but the local is sure this vessel wasn't here yesterday. A little later, it turns out this is the same ship that the sailors from the HMS Protector saw 5 months ago, thousands of miles from this place. The cargo ship, called the Alta, was built in 1976. Nobody knows who used it all this time and for what purposes. It's only known that in 2017, the ship was purchased by a new owner and marked with the flag of Tanzania. It's important to say that almost all cargo ships are equipped with AIS, Automatic Identification System, which is needed to track ship movements in the ocean. Since 2015, something strange started happening with the Alta's AIS. The ship disappeared from the satellites, then reappeared again. Over the past few years, this ship had changed several names and flags. It's not surprising that its AIS shut off and turned on numerous times. It's said that some of those who disable AIS on their ships do so to hide outlaw activities. The ship's captain, whoever it was, clearly didn't want to show the Alta's movements. As AIS showed in 2017, the ship had sailed near Greek port cities. The Alta made 12 stops in 3 such cities in different parts of Greece. Then, the AIS signal disappeared, and 10 months later, the Alta reappeared near the northern coast of Africa, 1,200 miles from Greece. In September of 2018, the ship was sailing about 1,400 miles southeast of Bermuda, and at that time, the crew members started having problems. There were 10 people on board the Alta. On September 19th, the ship's engine failed right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The nearest shore was very far away. The ship began to drift. As days passed, the crew couldn't fix the vessel. Food supplies were running low. The crew started to panic and tried to contact someone. The situation got worse as a strong hurricane was approaching the place where the ship broke down. Crew members contacted the U.S. Coast Guard. On October 2nd, a helicopter headed towards the ship. Food and water were unloaded on the Alta. This was enough for the crew to bide their time for several days. About a week later, a rescue boat sailed about 1,500 miles to reach the Alta and help the stranded sailors. Shortly before the start of the hurricane, American rescuers succeeded. The entire crew of the wrecked ship was taken to Puerto Rico. The Alta remained drifting in the ocean. After a while, another ship arrived to tow it to the coast of Guyana. Then, something went wrong again. The ship was hijacked. Who did it and why remains a mystery to this day. But then, for some unknown reason, the thieves decided to abandon the ship and left it to drift in the ocean. For almost a year, the ship's location couldn't be tracked. Then, in September 2019, the vessel was found by the British Royal Navy. How the Alta was able to cover the distance across the Atlantic and wash up on the coast of Ireland is unknown. An investigation has been launched in Ireland. It's necessary to identify the owner of the vessel and find a responsible person to take on the task of towing it. But no one has since been found. Once, an unknown person called the Irish authorities and introduced themselves as the owner of the ship, but didn't provide any evidence. Several barrels of oil were found on board the Alta. To dismantle the ship, the Irish authorities will need to spend about 10 million euros. Local residents are annoyed by the wreck too. Corroding metal is bad for the environment, and kids have already snuck on board and posted a video on the internet from inside the abandoned ship. The further fate of the Alta remains unresolved. It's still lying there. That ship sailed in the ocean for just 2 years. Now imagine if some other managed to drift for 38. In all that time, no one could catch this ship, and people still seek it. That vessel is called the SS Bechimo. It was a merchant ship owned by a Canadian trading company. In 1931, the ship got stuck in ice off the coast of Alaska. A strong snowstorm began. The team waited a week for it to end, but the storm only intensified. One day, the weather improved a bit, and part of the team was evacuated to the nearest city. Another part of the crew, with the captain, set up camp near the ship. The storm started again and didn't stop for a long time. The blizzard was so heavy that the ship's captain couldn't see beyond his arm's reach. Finally, when the storm was over, the captain saw that the ship simply vanished. He decided the Bechimo sank during the storm. A week later, the ship was found, drifting near the place where it was lost. The hull of the ship was damaged so badly that it was unsafe to sail on it. The captain decided to abandon the ship. However, it didn't sink. For the next 38 years, it was drifting at various points along the Alaskan coast. Several times, people climbed on the ship, including native Alaskan residents and a group of researchers. Attempts to save the vessel from the sea ended in failure. The salvage operations were hampered by drifting ice and bad weather. The last time it was seen was in 1969. The ship was frozen and blocked by the ice. In 2006, the government created a special project to find the Bechimo. However, in all these years, the ship still hasn't been found. Its fate is unknown. It's likely that the ship has finally found peace and is now lying on the seabed of the Chukchi Sea.